Welcome everybody to another episode of Enter the Nerdom. I'm here with my host,
Stan Morenzini.
And I'm Watson Bradshaw, and we are so grateful and pleased to bring on our guest today. He's an author, producer, writer, screenwriter, physicist. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, he holds a BS in physics and a master's in science, technology, and space from George Washington University. He was a science consultant on Star Trek, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, The Next Generation. He's a science consultant on the Orville currently. Mm-hmm.
Got to work on Cosmos.
Got to work on Cosmos. Got to work on Mars, the TV show. A body of work that we hope to.
And we're burying the lead. Tron.
Yeah,
Tron Uprising.
Yeah, Tron Uprising.
Let's be honest.
Andre Bormanis. Andre, thank you so much for coming on. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
As we were telling you before we started the podcast, we're just a group of nerds here. Unfortunately, our friend Chad Cook can't be here. Hopefully, he'll be here.
He's on special assignment.
Yeah, hopefully he'll be here for the next episode. But
he better.
But yeah, definitely. We talk about all things nerd on this podcast. And especially Star Trek and Tron is a big topic of discussion on here.
I mean, I try and bring it up at least every 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
My kid's sick of listening about it.
And so you were a big part of Star Trek, starting with The Next Generation.
Yeah.
And going into Enterprise. Mm-hmm. And you're currently a big part of the Orville right now. So we just wanted to have you on just to talk about your career and how you got into the entertainment industry and
how
writing.
Does someone with a NASA fellowship end up in Hollywood?
Yeah, long story, strange story. I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version, which is basically that, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, kind of a child of the space age, was totally enthralled by the Apollo program, seeing the first humans walk on the moon. Was a huge fan of Star Trek growing up. Didn't really understand. I remember seeing a couple of episodes or parts of a couple of episodes with my older brother when they were in first run in the late 60s, and I was a little kid and I understood none of it. But then of course it went away after 3 seasons, and then it started to come out in syndication. And I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. And when I was in high school, Star Trek started airing on the local independent station at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, weekdays. So perfect time for people like me to watch Star Trek coming home from high school. And was a huge fan. I read a book that had come out that a friend of mine had discovered called "The Making of Star Trek," written by a guy named Stephen Whitfield. Was his nom de plume. His actual name is Stephen Poe. And it was all about the making of the series, behind the scenes and how the show was developed, how the sets were designed and the scripts were written and the actors hired. And I was just like, it sounded like so much fun to me. And it was such a revelation because I didn't know, I had some vague idea of how TV shows are made. There's a set and there are cameras and there are actors and scripts. And, it's about as much as I knew about it. But to really see how a show like Star Trek came into being and how it struggled initially and how there was a pilot, and NBC loved the pilot, but they didn't think that it could work on TV, but they commissioned a second pilot, which would have been unheard of at that time. And, it just all became, to coin a phrase, fascinating to me. And I was a total science nerd, of course, back in those days, and still am, and fell in love with astronomy when I was 7 or 8 years old. Decided around that time I was going to be an astronomer, and read a lot of Carl Sagan. I was a huge science fiction fan, Ray Bradbury, Robert A. Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke. So I certainly, absorbed all of that extraordinary fiction and extraordinary nonfiction. It is still amazing to me that, the Apollo program happened and it succeeded so spectacularly. And, my grandfather was born in 1892. He lived to see men walk on the moon.
Wow.
I had a piano teacher when I was a little kid, a woman who lived across the street. She was 21 years old when the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903. She lived to see men walk on the moon.
Wow.
Charles Lindbergh, first man to fly across the Atlantic solo, right? Amazing feat in 1927, I think, is when that happened. And that was a huge event, worldwide, attention and acclaim. He was at the launch of Apollo 11. He was only 66 years old.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, when you think about the extraordinary advancement of those technologies in such a relatively short period of time, I was, when I was in grade school, high school, I figured I'd be flying to the moon by the end of the century. I certainly thought that NASA would send crews to Mars and the outer planets. When I was an adult, if not even a little sooner, right? And then it all seemed to kind of become, history.
Right.
It all slowed down.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand until I was well into adulthood why that happened the way it did. That the technological development was motivated by the Cold War and by the race with the Soviets, and that Sputnik, when they beat us to sending a satellite up into low Earth orbit, it scared the bejesus out of everybody, and understandably in retrospect. And then they got the first man in space before we did. And that was an extraordinarily fraught and frightening time. And it was that sort of unique situation of this Cold War rivalry between these two superpowers who had the ability to utterly destroy each other with atomic weapons and rockets that motivated the moon race and Kennedy's famous, we're going to put a man on the moon before this decade is out and return him safely to Earth. And once that goal was achieved, well, NASA's budget was reduced substantially.
Yeah.
And understandably, because there were other concerns. We were spending about 5% of the federal budget on the Apollo program in the heyday of the mid-1960s. We spend maybe 0.5% today, if that. So that was not sustainable. And then I came to understand why, all of that kind of ground to a halt. And yet, all of these technologies that were developed for Apollo, for the military, particularly microcomputer processors, created the PC revolution of the 70s and the 80s. And that opened up a whole lot of other doors, right? Well, I, continued in my quest to become an astronomer when I got to college, studied physics, and then did some graduate work in physics and astronomy. Became kind of disenchanted. I saw a lot of friends spending like 6 or 7 years in grad school, getting a PhD in astronomy, and there were like no jobs in astronomy. They would get jobs as computer programmers. And that was kind of the last thing I wanted to do, right? Because I just wasn't that interested. I had to learn how to, write programs in Fortran for my undergraduate degree, and, that's fine. And it wasn't something that appealed to me as a career. I loved astronomy from an aesthetic and kind of philosophical perspective, and I'm still interested in it at that level, and still have some pretty substantial telescopes and like using them. And when I ease out of writing into my retirement, I probably will go back and try to do some research in astronomy at a level that somebody like an advanced amateur, of my caliber could do. But I definitely, after my undergraduate degree, I kind of cast about for what do I really want to do with my life. I did love writing, and I did love reading, and I loved literature, and I'd done some magazine writing. And I had to, there was a requirement in one of my senior level physics classes where we had to recreate some famous experiment from modern physics, set up, the experiment in the lab, carry out the experiment, report our results, and then write a lab report, 30, 40 pages, whatever. So my partner and I chose something called Compton scattering, where gamma rays will scatter off of aluminum atoms, and there's the whole wave-particle duality in physics where, electrons act like waves under certain circumstances, and things like gamma rays act like particles. And so we did our experiment, and we wrote our reports, and one of my the teacher of that class, the professor, Dr. Huffman, singled out my report and told the class that they should read it because it was like a model of good scientific writing.
Oh wow!
And then he told
That's high praise.
Yeah, it kind of was. And then he took me aside and he said, there aren't a lot of people in the sciences who are good writers. You might want to consider a career in technical writing. And I said, oh, well, that's, the first time I'd gotten that kind of praise from any professor, probably, other than whatever grade I got, assuming it was a good grade. And so, that was always sort of in the back of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I got involved in the microcomputer industry in the 80s, when the IBM PC came out and there were these programs like Lotus 1-2-3. One of my friends from growing up was working for a company that was developing classes for teaching people how to use these software application programs, and he showed me Lotus 1-2-3. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. It was one of the first spreadsheet programs. And so while I was sort of casting about for what I really wanted to do with my life, I worked part-time conducting classes at Computerland stores to show people how to use the software for their new PCs.
Right.
In the meantime, I started to take some creative writing classes, some screenwriting classes, and I wrote a Star Trek The Next Generation spec script. Star Trek Next Gen came on the air in like 86, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I watched, the first season, and I was like, this is okay, not great. There were a couple of great episodes, but it was,
those first couple of seasons are really
rough. A little rough, yeah.
A little rough.
Yeah.
And I thought, God, I could write a script better than that, Very arrogantly, I admit. And I'd heard that they had this, open submission policy.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a couple of friends who, I'd grown up with who had become writers here in Los Angeles, writing television. One, Clay Graham, who became a sitcom writer a couple of years out of college and has done quite well in that. And I talked to him about it. He gave me some tips on writing screenplays, showed me the format, got a couple of screenwriting books, from the library. And I had an idea for a Next Generation episode, it involved Riker and this, that, and the other. And so I kind of developed it. It took me several months to really kind of start putting out pages of this 1-hour TV spec script. I wasn't sure where it was going, and I kind of had to put it aside for a while. And then I just woke up one morning and I finally knew how to finish it. And it took me like 3 days, and I finished the thing.
Oh, wow.
And then did some revisions and rewrites, had Clay and some other people read it, got some notes, and then shipped it off to Paramount. This was probably around 1988 or 89 at this point. And a friend of mine's dad knew one of the producers, a guy named Maurice Hurley, who was a producer on the show at that time. And I think they got it to Maurice, but, it went to whoever the readers were for that. And, the show hired a couple of, people who would basically their full-time job was to read all these spec scripts that were coming in. And some of them were really good. And in fact, two of our best writers got their starts by submitting spec scripts.
Oh, wow.
Renee Echevarria and Ron Moore.
Yeah.
And Renee's, I think, was the script that became the episode Lal, where Data creates his own daughter, his own child.
Yeah.
Amazing script. A great story. One of the best episodes of any Star Trek, right? And so, it was there was a fair amount of competition. There were some obviously very talented people doing this. A couple, 3 months after I sent in my script, I get a package in the mail, big thick package from Paramount Pictures, and I thought, this is either an envelope stuffed full of cash, or it's my spec script coming back to me with a thanks but no thanks. Right. Sadly, it was the latter. But I got a nice little note from Maurice Hurley, who said, this is a nicely done script and not what we're looking for, but feel free to submit again. That was kind of encouraging. And I'd taken some screenwriting classes at Arizona State, and with a teacher whose name is Steve Geller. Steve wrote the adaptation of the Kurt Vonnegut novel Slaughterhouse-Five. He wrote that script, which was a great film.
Yeah.
Wow.
He wrote a novel that was turned into the movie Pretty Poison in the 60s with Anthony Perkins. Plays kind of a psycho guy with a delusion and, typecast.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And terrific writer, and a great teacher. Learned a lot from him. and he was very encouraging. And then, you know, this was around the time that the first space shuttle disaster, the Challenger disaster, happened, and I was like unbelievably shocked, and remember where I was when I heard the news, and you know, to this day, and I started to read a bunch of stuff in the newspaper and in various magazines about how could this have happened, you know. How did we lose this, you know, $2 billion spacecraft and 7 lives, you know, and started to read about all of the compromises in the design of that system, and, you know, the safety issues that were raised and kind of ignored by, you know, the various tiers of management, and, you know, the whole history, which has been discussed and analyzed in great detail in the 35 years since, you know, plus years since that happened. And a name kept coming up in a lot of these articles, a guy named John Logsdon, who was the director of something called the Space Policy Institute at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I started to read about him and this institute and found out that they had a master's program in a field called Science, Technology, and Public Policy. It was all about sort of the politics and economics of high technology science, and John's particular focus, the space program. And he has a PhD in political science. His dissertation was about John F. Kennedy's decision to greenlight the Apollo program. And in fact, you can buy the book version of that called The Decision to Go to the Moon. And I read that, I'm like, this is so fascinating. This is like right up my alley. Combines my interests in, you know, politics and history and science and the space program, you know, and all of the behind the scenes stuff, you know. So to make a very long story short, I applied to the program. I was accepted. Didn't know how I was going to pay for it, but then subsequently found out through Dr. Logsdon that NASA was offering a couple of fellowships to the program that would essentially pay my costs. And he suggested I apply for that, and I was awarded that space grant fellowship. And in August of 1991, moved from Phoenix to Washington, D.C. And spent 2 years there at the Space Policy Institute, which was fantastic. And you know, John's a great teacher, a great mentor. We're still good friends. And he's still writing. He's still, you know, he's retired now from the university, but you know, he's still writing books about different aspects of the space program, mostly the different presidents and how they, you know, since Kennedy had approached this, you know, funding for NASA and so forth. And so that was all great. Now, I still kind of had the writing bug, and I still was coming up with ideas for Star Trek: The Next Generation, but I didn't really have time to try to write another spec script. And so I called again my old friend Clay, who had, you know, moved up quite a bit in the TV world. And he said, well, if you want to try to just pitch stories, you gotta set up a pitch meeting. I said, well, how do I do that? Well, you have to have an agent, really. You know, they're not going to just take some, you know, John Doe off the street. Even if you wrote a spec script that some producer said a few years ago they liked. Well, how do I get an agent? Well, let me ask a couple of people. Well, you know, the Writers Guild actually, I don't know if they still do this, they used to put out a list of agencies that would take on first-time writers. Typically smaller, so-called boutique agencies, right? And Clay got a couple of names for me. I got a couple of names, I think, off the Writers Guild list. This was before websites, of course. So at any rate, you know, I'd written my Star Trek Next Gen spec script, and I'd written an adaptation of a science fiction novel in one of Steve Geller's classes. So that was like a 110-page adaptation of a Stanislaw Lem novel that Steve really liked. So I had stuff to shop. So I would basically take these scripts and send them to an agency. So I sent them to the first agent Clay recommended. A few weeks later, thanks but no thanks. Oh, but you know, so-and-so might be interested. So, I'll give me their address. I'll send them on to them, you know. So I did the Hollywood shuffle.
I was going to say, it's that old song and dance.
8 months, 9 months, something like that. And finally found somebody, a woman named Carrie Kelsey at a small agency, Montero Rose, who liked it. She knew science fiction, and she knew, you know, some of the Star Trek people. And she said, let me see what I can do, you know. Great. Well, you know, weeks go by. I call Carrie. Hey, any chance of getting a pitch meeting? no, I called them last week. They're not taking any pitches at the moment, da-da-da. This went on for several months. And I was just about to give up. I was kind of like, this was now my final semester, my fourth semester at GW. I was going to have to make a decision, stick with the program or graduate and see what I could do, Probably stay in Washington, maybe work at NASA headquarters or, some think tank, whatever.
It's not a bad backup plan.
Which is not a bad backup plan at all, although we can talk more about that. At any rate, I thought, all right, this is going to be my last call to Carrie.
Yeah.
She says, I call her and she picks up and I'm like, oh, hey, Carrie, how's it going? Oh, good. Hey, anything going on with Star? Oh, I think I faxed them a couple of your stories and they passed. Like, well, I thought I was going to go in and,
Yeah.
It's like, fine. So I'm just about to hang up the phone. And she says, oh, but they're looking for a new science consultant. Like, science consultant? Well, what's that? She said, well, they have this guy. His name's Narain Shankar, and he's a physicist. And he came out here for an internship and convinced the producers on Star Trek that they should keep him on as a consultant, helping them with the science and technology language in stories and dialogue to make sure that the audience finds this whatever they're saying believable, because you got a lot of scientists and engineers in your audience and a lot of people who are just much more savvy these days, even if they're not in the profession. And she said, well, they just offered Narain a staff writer job, so they're looking for somebody to replace him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Narain was one of their clients, one of the Montero Rose clients, and that's how Carrie knew about this. So she said, oh, they're looking for somebody who has has science credentials, who knows the show, who knows how to read a script and knows how to talk to writers. Because a lot of the people that they'd used before they got Narain, were like, they'd call some engineer at JPL and they had a question and they'd say, what if, we want to do this. Oh, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, then what can we do? I don't know, They didn't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
And they were all very kind of doctrinaire and just like, dismissive at times. And Narain understood that, first rule, tell a really good story. And if you can work some really cool science into that, great.
Right. You can bridge that gap.
If you have to make it, if you got to stretch the science into the realm of science fiction, well, find a way to do that has some seed of credibility, that has some, and again, remember the context of the Star Trek universe.
Yeah.
Because we have phasers, and we have transporters, and we have photon torpedoes, and warp drive, So clearly, 400 years in the future, we're going to have a lot of technologies and know a lot of science that we don't know and understand today. Otherwise, we wouldn't be out there exploring the galaxy. So you have to have that kind of a mindset, which most scientists kind of don't.
Sure.
So Carrie set me up with a phone call with a woman named Jerry Taylor, who was, I think, a supervising producer, a writing producer on Star Trek The Next Generation, which was in its 6th season, I think, at this time. And so, she and I kind of hit it off over the phone. And she invited me to come out and visit them at Paramount if I happen to be in the area anytime in the foreseeable future. And as luck would have it, a few weeks later, I was supposed to go to Tucson for a planetary science conference. And so went to that. In fact, met Freeman Dyson there, which was cool. That was exciting.
Wow.
I was always a fan of his work and his writing as well as his physics, right? And so then I drove up to Phoenix to my parents' house and drove from there to Los Angeles. And the next day had a meeting at Paramount, and that was my first time on a lot, you know. And Paramount, oh my God, and the heart building, where it all happened, right? So I'm there and I sit down.
Not intimidating at all.
No, not at all. Yeah, right. So I get into this meeting with, Jerry is there, Ira Stephen Bear, Michael Piller was there, Brandon Braga, Renee Echeverria.
Oh, wow.
Ken Biller might have been there at that time. Oh, gosh, but it's like, oh my God, all these people whose names I see in the credits.
Sure.
Whose stories I had a pretty good, memory back then of who was writing what and, the stories that I liked. And I kind of knew who these people were from just looking at fan magazines and stuff like that, And we had a very nice conversation. And Michael Piller, who was an executive producer on Next Gen at the time and co-created Voyager with Jerry and Rick Berman, he said, I'm working on a script for our new show Deep Space Nine, which I think was in its first season then.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it needs a lot of help with technical notes,
Mm.
So he gave me the script, his first draft, and Narain showed me some samples of his technical notes in the format that he used to send notes to the producers, right? And Narain was in that meeting, of course. And so I drove back to Phoenix the next day, read the script that night. Next morning, drove to the library, got some physics and astronomy books off the shelves, did some research, came up with some ideas, wrote down some different possibilities. And I think later that afternoon or evening, I faxed, Michael and Jerry 8 or 9 pages of my technical notes on his script, and flew back to D.C. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from Jerry, and she said, Michael really loved your notes, nice. And if you want the job, it's yours. And they needed me to start literally the week that I finished my NASA fellowship.
Oh, wow. Great timing.
In May of 1993.
Oh, that's wild.
I finished my coursework for my master's degree. I still had a thesis to write, which I did after I moved out here. And started in May of 93 as the science consultant on the final season of Star Trek The Next Generation, which was also the second season of Deep Space Nine. And I always thought it was just like, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. It was just timing, But sometime later, I think it was Lolita Faccio, who was our script coordinator on the show. She's the one who puts all the scripts and drafts together and revisions, and And she had told me, they talked to a bunch of different people around that time. And then when they met you, Jerry and everybody else was
just clicked.
He's the guy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we like him. He doesn't make us nervous. He doesn't,
Well, like you say, it's hard for, if you're using real science.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have, because you're right, there's a lot of engineers, a lot of technical, savvy people.
Right.
It's the right brain, left brain dynamic, right? Like they just can't get that across.
Yeah.
And you're right, like it should be about story.
Right.
Like one of my favorite shows growing up as a kid, obviously the original Trek.
Yeah.
And I'm a big Doctor Who fan.
Oh yeah.
And the amount you could, if you did a drinking game for how many times they said reverse the polarity.
Yeah.
You just, it'd be ridiculous. But it's all about telling those stories, and there's very few people. I love that you stuck with your guns, basically, like you weren't, just like you had a goal, you had, what you wanted to do, and you went for it. And that's awesome.
Yeah, and obviously, I stand on the shoulders of giants. In addition to Narain Shankar, who did a lot of, he had his way of approaching the science and technical language, especially in the dialogue, and I took a lot of cues from him, and notes that he had done, which I had access to.
I was going to ask about, because it's an interesting beast you're dealing with, because it's got 40 years of continuity basically, and. Are you taking? Are you taking notes about stuff they said in the original Trek and going, well, the science is way off there, but because they said it there, we still have to use that?
To a degree, yeah. And the other two people I have to mention are Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach, who wrote the Star Trek Technical Manual, which came out, I think, the year before.
I have those in the office over here. Yeah.
And they were the ones who really kind of, went through it with a fine-toothed comb and came up with a lot of the language and a lot of the sort of theoretical underpinnings, if you will, of how the Starship Enterprise works as a ship.
Yeah.
Right.
And, I think Rick, had told me once that, when we talk about the warp drive, we do kind of think about it like, an internal combustion engine.
Right.
In the sense that, the warp plasma is the fuel, the dilithium crystals, that's the carburetor, And it helps you kind of, you have to have those models. You have to have those analogies in your mind in order to kind of make it feel like there is a logic to it. Because that's what the audience is paying attention to. And I always thought of the job as, if I were walking down the hallway at JPL and I heard a couple of engineers debating some technical problem, a thruster on a spacecraft or a sensor, this, that, and the other, and no, we should do this, no, we should do that. What about that? What about I might not have any real idea of what they're talking about,
Right.
but I would certainly understand that they know what they're talking about. And so that was kind of my litmus test
Sure.
Yeah.
for some of the language that I would use and put into dialogue. And the other thing was, if I couldn't find real science to, address the issue at hand in a
Right.
given scene, I would always try to find some analogy to real science that could be the foundation for a science fictional explanation of how this is going to work, right?
Yeah.
So I remember in my first year of the science consultant job, I only worked on one season of Next Generation, the final season, right? So there was an episode where a planet was experiencing devastating earthquakes, and they were triggering volcanic activity and tsunamis, and this planet was, they were going to be toast if we couldn't do something about it. And the Starship Enterprise was dispatched to try to help them deal with this problem, Either we're going to have to evacuate as many people as we possibly can, which means condemning 99% of the population to death or whatever, or we got to figure out a way to try to reverse this extreme tectonic activity. Well, how do you do that? Well, here's the problem: the planet's liquid molten core was cooling off rapidly. We have to figure out a way to reheat the core of the planet. And I read this and I'm like, oh. How does one do that?
Right.
Because, of course, this is a Class M planet,
Sure.
meaning it's like the Earth, so it's 7,000 or 8,000 miles in diameter. The core is made of probably something like iron and nickel, typical, what we would expect for this kind of a body in any solar system, not just our own. And it's hot, 4,000 or 5,000 degrees, Fahrenheit, or whatever the temperature might be, maybe even hotter than that. And all matter has this property that we call thermal inertia. Just like inertia, if you're trying to push a 1 kilogram block of ice across a table, that's a lot easier than a 1,000 kilogram block of ice, even if that ice is slippery. Inertia, right, is going to resist that change in motion. Well, the same thing happens with heat. Try to raise the temperature of a body, thermal inertia will resist that, resist quote unquote, or lower the temperature. It works both ways. So I'm thinking, well, we've got this starship. It's very powerful. It can travel faster than the speed of light, but God only knows how much energy it would take to change the temperature of the core of a Class M planet,
Right.
even 10 degrees, And, I'm like, what are we going to do here? How do we make this work, Well, as I thought about it, I realized, there is something every bit as extraordinary that happens in the real world every single day, that if you had told somebody 100 years ago this thing would work the way that you describe it, they would think you're nuts. And what is that? Well, it's a nuclear pile. So in every nuclear reactor, every nuclear power plant, they're all fission reactors. We hope someday to have fusion, and that's being worked on. But all fission reactors, meaning that atoms of uranium are splitting and releasing a few neutrons. And high energy neutrons, that generates the heat. But it also triggers a chain reaction if it's done right, and if it's densely enough packed uranium and pure enough. Well, a couple of those neutrons will then split some other uranium atoms. They'll send out neutrons which will split more, and it's a geometric progression, right? Well, neutrons are invisible subatomic particles. If we had a slab of, appropriately refined uranium of the right density and so forth, and the right isotope, the size of your refrigerator over there, and we introduced a handful of these invisible neutrons in the right way, something that would weigh, not even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a gram, well, in a few hours, the temperature of that nuclear pile would rise by hundreds of degrees. who would believe that 100 years ago? That
Yeah.
you could do these little, it's like pixie dust. It's like magic, right? No,
It's witchcraft.
It's
Yeah.
neutrons,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, so Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach had established in the Star Trek Technical Manual that the phaser beams of our ships are particle beam weapons, and the particle that is at the kind of the core of that beam is something called a nation. This is a fictional particle, right? Because Mike and Rick realized, if we say antiprotons or if we say this or that or the other, there's something real.
Right.
Well, then we're going to get called on that because people are going to say, oh, well, if you calculate the amount of energy, the beam of antiprotons, whatever it might be, right? And various other complications that would arise if we try to use real subatomic particles, in that context. So, we create a fictional particle. So, in my conception, I basically decreed that the nations have this property that in the cores of certain M-class planets, nations can initiate chain reactions in some of the elements. Maybe it's certain isotopes of iron or nickel, or maybe it's something else that will create a runaway chain reaction effect that can generate a tremendous amount of heat in a relatively short amount of time with a single, with a handful of phaser pulses, But we got to get down to the core of the planet, in order to, inject them, as it were. Okay, problem solved, right? So again, it's far-fetched, of course, yes, but the nation is kind of my fig leaf. It's the thing that says, well, it's analogous to this nuclear reactor, which we know works and we know is amazing, right?
Yeah.
And nobody would have believed it 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Literally 100 years ago.
Sure.
Nobody would have believed it because the nuclear chain reaction wasn't conceived until like the 1930s, and the first real nuclear chain reaction didn't happen until the early 40s, right? So that's the way that I tended to, think about the job.
Right.
And much of the time, I was just very cognizant of the fact that, we were trapped, the warp factors were associated with certain multiples of the speed of light. If they said, we got to get to such and such, and we know, oh, that's, 28 light years away, I know what warp factor corresponds to getting there in the next hour, right? So there are things like that I always try to be consistent about.
Right.
Occasionally, that might slip through the cracks and we get someplace a little faster than we should have, but that's the kind of stuff that, the original Star Trek lore with the dilithium crystals, of course, was something got carried over, the warp drive, warp plasma, and things of that nature, I think. Were carryovers from the original, the phasers, They didn't really talk much in great detail in the original series about how those things worked.
I was going to say,
Right,
did they bring
yeah.
up antimatter at all? in
They
the
did.
original?
Oh,
Yeah, in the
a
original,
matter-antimatter reaction,
Yeah.
and then it was moderated somehow by the dilithium
Yeah.
crystals.
I remember they had antimatter phasers at some point in the original, I think.
They might have,
yeah.
But they never really explained how phaser worked.
Yeah,
Because
exactly, yeah,
Gene
it's just,
Roddenberry
yeah.
was like, we don't have to.
Right.
It's
right.
like if you're watching a Western and
Yeah.
somebody pulls out a 6-shooter and shoots somebody,
Yeah.
you
No
don't
one's
need to
asking.
explain about the gunpowder and the
It's
and the
true.
Right.
shell and the
It's true.
Right.
the firing pin and all of that jazz, right?
Were you a big part of the? There was an episode in Star Trek in the Next Generation where they figured out warp drive was causing damage to the subspace.
Right. No, but that was Narain Shankar.
Right.
Who did that
Okay, yeah.
episode, who was my predecessor as a PhD
Yeah,
in physics.
because they
so-
couldn't go over warp 7 unless they
Yeah.
had like specific
Yes.
permission to do so.
Explicit
right?
orders from
Yeah.
headquarters. Yeah.
See, I never. Yeah, I was always like, why don't they just, say
Yeah, 'cause,
warp 20? But
Yeah.
then in Voyager, they do.
Well, because
the
in warp
10 limit.
warp
yes.
10, that it
And-
takes up the ship will take up every single point
It's
in
like,
the,
yeah,
in the
it's
universe.
It's infinite
something,
velocity.
right.
In
Yeah.
velocity, so you'd be everywhere at once.
So
right?
that's
And
why
you
the
become a
assumption was
weird
it was
fish person.
impossible, right,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hit warp 10.
Yes,
Well,
that was
and
the
then
idea.
Paris becomes a weird fish person.
He
because-
That's
became
right, yeah,
He became
yeah,
an amphibian. Yeah.
That's right.
That was
yeah.
one of Brannon's episodes.
And him and
because
Janeway had little fish
Oh, yeah.
babies.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
a weird way to end a show, man. I'm just saying.
Brannon loves turning the ship into a haunted house.
Oh.
That's his
Yes.
favorite thing.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of
And
sense.
he's a big horror fan. And he and I wrote an episode of Orville in season 3 that where we have an old flame of Dr. Finn's come aboard the ship, and they visit this space station that has been abandoned but is sending out a distress call, and it turned out to be a trap and a way for the for the aliens who had built that station to propagate their species by
Mm.
infecting species that had the capability to get into the station and figure that stuff out with
Right.
their own DNA and transform them. And so that
Oh wow.
kind of turned Orville into a haunted house for a couple of acts as these things were starting to take over the ship and turned off systems. And that was a lot of fun. But that was, a great example of how this place that feels like home suddenly becomes a hostile territory.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that was a big part of Voyager as well. It was just it's just this tiny little ship that's trying to make its way back, and they're constantly running into to every single. They're trying to kill them and slave them.
It's one of my
the
favorite
Hirogen
shows.
were hunting them for a long time. They took
Yeah.
the ship and were hunting them on the holodeck.
Right. And we did Year of Hell. And
Right.
Yeah.
Year of Hell.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, that was one of my favorite shows because they didn't have the support of the Federation.
Yes.
Like they were really lost in space, and just the fact that they had to like conserve resources.
Yeah.
Like they couldn't just replicate anything. And they had to come up with their own. They came up with like the Delta Flyer and stuff like that. And it's I love that show so much. And
thanks.
And Enterprise as well, having that kind of like pioneering spirit of just like. It was felt very much like a submarine show,
right?
In a way, like they didn't quite know how to. They weren't trusting the tech, like
They didn't have tractor beams at the time.
That was the fun of that. The fun of Enterprise was the fact that it was a prequel. It was 85 or 100 years before the original series, and instead of being the sort of seasoned heroes of the original series or Next Gen or Voyager or DS9. These guys were new kids on the block.
Yeah.
And they'd never been, they'd been to the moon, they'd been to Mars, maybe Alpha Centauri or something, but this is the first time that humans were really going out there beyond, the few star systems, closest to us. And, for Kirk or Picard, beaming down to an M-class, previously unexplored M-class planet was just another day at the office.
Sure. Yeah.
For Archer and the gang, it was like, oh my God, we're on a new planet.
You sense the danger.
And so we could tell stories from that perspective that, really, I think, connected better with the audience in a lot of ways because they're people like us as opposed to these idealized heroic figures, of the other shows. Putting it. And that was a lot of, fun. I ended up pitching stories and eventually Jerry and Michael bought a story, and then they bought another one a month later, and then they were shorthanded, with the writing staff. I think in season 3 of Voyager, and Jerry called me and said, "We've got a story. We have nobody to write the teleplay. Would you like to take a crack at it?" Oh wow! And I said, "Sure." And I did, and I wrote it, and turned it in 2 weeks later, and they really liked it. Jerry thought I did a very good job, and so I ended up writing 6 or 7 episodes of Voyager, writing or co-writing. Yeah. And then by the time Enterprise came along, Brandon said, we just got to bring you onto the writing staff. We probably should have done it a while ago, and but now is the time. And so I became a writer and eventually a producer on Enterprise, and that was a great experience. And I got to, both with Voyager and with Enterprise, I got to see those shows start from an idea, become, a treatment, a character Bible, and then a pilot script, and then got to see the sets built, and that was amazing to watch. And it was great to be, part of those shows from the very beginning. And especially those Enterprise sets you mentioned, the sort of submarine look. Brannon and Rick Berman are, top executive producer, toured a nuclear submarine with Herman Zimmerman, set designer, because we had to try to suggest, this is the tricky part of Enterprise from a, sort of a design perspective, was we had to try to suggest both the past and the future. The show was 100 years before Kirk and Spock, right?
Yeah.
And you look at the original series today, well, some of that looks kind of primitive, right?
Sure.
But Enterprise was also 150 years in our future, right? Mid-22nd century. And so we had to suggest both the future and the past.
Yeah.
So we knew one way to do that was make it more cramped, make it more sort of utilitarian looking. Doesn't look like a hotel lobby, it doesn't look like, Next Gen especially big wide corridors
Yeah.
and carpeting, you know.
Right.
and
Everyone's
it's like,
getting Earl Grey tea.
yeah, exactly. So it was a little
The
more
holodecks,
yeah, a little more nitty gritty on
Yeah.
on Enterprise, and then not all of the luxuries. You know, the quarters were more cramped, and the transporter. You know, Brandon didn't want to have a transporter like
Right.
the first year of the show.
Oh wow.
Because he thought, let's save that for the future.
Yeah.
In fact, he even really wanted to kind of spend most of the first season on Earth and see the Enterprise being built, which I think would have
that
been
would
pretty
have been
cool.
interesting.
And
Yeah.
see the debate
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
should we do this? We don't know what's out there.
Yeah.
We know the next door neighbors, but we don't know what's out now 100 light years from here.
Right.
Thousands of star systems within
Right.
100 light years. God knows what those people could be up to, right? But Paramount was very insistent on no, sorry, Star Trek, you got to have the ship
gotta have a
right
ship.
out of the gate.
Yeah.
You got to have the transporter, so.
Uh,
But at least we made it experimental, and we didn't use it that often.
There's the pilot episode when they try beaming
Yeah.
two people and they get debris like embedded in
Yeah.
them.
Right. Yeah.
And I love that. I mean, it was just like, oh wow, this stuff is like really. They're not testing anything, just
Right.
putting
No,
it in a
yeah.
ship and going.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that was a great way to get about like you said, like making it feel different from what we've seen. Where you're right, like Picard and everyone, they're nothing really to. Not pun, but nothing phased them really,
Right.
because it was kind of like it's just an everyday at work kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And this, like I said, had that pioneer spirit, that kind of like we're just gonna go into space and hope we don't get.
Well, in those shows, whenever they ran into something, they always had the backup. Like, well, there's other ships out there. We may be
Yeah,
on our own
right.
for a while, but
Yeah.
but there's other ships out
Right.
there, and we run into some serious trouble. We can just send a distress call.
Right.
Yeah.
Enterprise never felt that way.
Right.
It's like, this is it. Like, we get
Yeah.
in trouble, we're on our own. Like, this is that's it. It was like the first manned mission to Mars.
Mhm.
Like if something happens, you're on your own out there.
Yeah.
There's nobody coming.
Yep.
So, and Enterprise felt like that many times.
Yeah.
Was
When I
there?
was
I
watching
mean,
it.
was there any kind of like trepidation going to doing a prequel show, like not going forward with past next gen stuff?
Yeah, there was some resistance to that, I think. But, the alternative, which was kicked around for a little bit, was, well, what are we going to do? Go another 100 years in the future?
Right.
How
Yeah.
different is that going to really be?
Right.
Sure.
Oh, the transporters have more range.
Yeah.
Ship's a little faster,
Yeah.
right?
A
Maybe
little
there's
sleeker.
some-
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe there's
Yeah.
some other, new, geegack that we can invent
Yeah.
for that. But ultimately, that didn't feel very satisfying.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the idea of going back to the roots to see the creation of the Star Trek universe,
Mhm.
how did we arrive at the Prime Directive? How did we
Yeah.
establish a good relationship, with the Vulcans?
Mhm.
How did we meet these other species, like the Andorians,
Yeah.
and Fred Decker, by the way, wrote that first Andorian episode
That's right,
where Jeffrey Combs played Shran,
Yeah,
who was a
so
great character.
Oh,
And Jeffrey's a great guy, and it was so much fun to get to do those episodes
Yeah.
with him, and so we got to do a lot of really fun stuff on that show, and
Archer was such a great character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was this great blend of kind of Kirk and Picard in a way.
Yeah.
He has this great
Yeah.
like spirit about him. So.
Yeah, and he knew that he was he was going to be the figure that kind of makes or breaks
Mhm.
how the rest of the galaxy feels about
Right.
humans as we start
Mhm.
getting out there, and that was a great kind of a burden to carry, but he was
Mhm.
ready to carry it, and he didn't always know what was the right thing to do in a given
Right.
circumstance, and Kirk and Picard were always pretty definitive. They
Mhm.
never really spent too much time thinking about what the next right move would be. Sometimes they did, but and that became that was a little bit of a challenge too, because that some people think, well, he doesn't look very decisive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no,
right.
he was deliberative,
Right.
but that didn't mean he wasn't decisive. In fact, in the second episode, he's extremely decisive when we come across this ship with these dead bodies in it, and it's like, oh, this is creepy. Let's get out of here, and they start to leave, and then Archer's like, what are we doing?
Mhm.
If that was us, would we want somebody to just kind of look us over and say, oh, Jesus, I want to see what happened to them. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
No, that's completely wrong.
Right.
And he turned the ship around, I thought that was a great moment
Yeah.
and a great scene
Yeah.
and a really good episode. So, I'm very proud of the work that we did on Enterprise, and had a great time. I was there all 4 seasons, and we did 98, 99 episodes, and so people say, oh well, it ended after 4 seasons, so it was kind of a failure. No, 4 seasons is a really good run.
Yeah,
absolutely.
For any show now.
Almost 100 episodes.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? Most shows don't go more than 13.
Right.
A lot of them don't go that far.
Yeah, most of them on Netflix don't.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Your technical notes.
Yes.
How did you? I guess. How did you break those down so that they would make sense to people who aren't like very?
Are you talking about dum-dums like us?
Yeah, pretty like yeah. So if you were giving them to me, how would you break it down?
What's the layman? Version?
Yeah, the dummies version. Yeah. Would you try to do that or just?
How do you explain a Dyson sphere?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dyson. Yeah.
No. First of all, the writers are all very smart people, and they may not be technically literate. They may not have, they may not have studied physics and math and engineering in college, but that doesn't mean that they don't understand basic concepts.
Yeah, sure.
If you explain them properly. And one of the things that really helped me, I think, be good in this role is I was a teacher, I taught when I did that sort of unhappy year of grad school in physics. I taught undergraduate physics labs, and I was pretty good, I think, at explaining physics concepts to freshmen, who had maybe had a year of high school physics or maybe not. I got to teach one semester. This sounds so sexist now in retrospect. It's 40 years ago, guys. Okay, I just want to point that out.
No one's getting canceled.
Yeah. No, it was just there was an actual class taught at the University of Arizona, where I did my undergraduate in that first year of grad school, called Physics for Nurses.
Oh, wow.
And the vast majority of nursing students back then, were women.
Sure.
And so all of the TAs, this was like, and of course most of the physics grad students were guys. We had a few women in the program, and but most of them were guys, and they were like, "Oh, I want to teach the nurses." Well, I, for whatever reason, got that class.
Why is my head just going to like Revenge of the Nerds kind of situation?
Right.
It is such a nerdball thing, and they were very nice, and but again, it was like. These were people who were going into nursing, and they were in the life sciences. Physics is, it's very mathematical and precise, and it's, there is a certain amount of art to medicine as well as science, and so, it was basically teaching concepts in physics that would probably have some relevance to the life sciences, and I'm forgetting some of the experiments. It was pretty basic stuff. There may have been some stuff about, fluid volume and things like that, because that's something that, they would work with, and, like blood transfusions and saline, and I don't know. I don't remember. This was a long time ago, but the point is that, I had to talk to them in layman's terms. I had to assume that they didn't know anything about physics.
Sure.
Maybe they did or maybe they didn't, but I can't assume that, right? And I found that, I was pretty good at explaining basic concepts to people who had never been introduced to those concepts, right? So when I did my science notes, I always wrote them in that sort of, layman's perspective. And, I always thought of my heroes like Carl Sagan, and I certainly don't write prose at his level and with his elegance, but, I try to make sure that it was simple, straightforward, and comprehensible. I didn't use a lot of gobbledygook, When I did that, when I did my notes on that show where they had to reheat the core of the planet, I just wrote a little paragraph. I said, oh, here's what I'm thinking. Very hard to change the temperature of a huge mass, and our ship, as powerful as it is, the only thing we really have going for us are the phaser weapons, and here's how things work in a nuclear reactor. So I used that analogy that I shared with you guys, and said, so we've established on the show in previous episodes that the phaser beams use these particles called nations, and I'm going to suggest that we make the claim in this episode, that this is how they interact with the core of a planet,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore we can, save this civilization with a well-focused pulse of nadions from our phaser banks, right? And and that's enough, enough said. And they got it, and they thought, oh, that's a good idea, like that, thanks. And then the other thing I would do is I would sometimes get calls from writers who said, we're doing this episode, and there's a comet in the episode, and the comet has religious significance for the Bajorans. It's a Deep Space Nine episode.
Yeah.
But we have, our science officer, Dax, who, wants to do scans, and she's got to have some technobabble to report to Cisco about, oh, tell me about this comet. Well, it's so-and-so and such and such. And so Bradley and David, who were writing the script, were like, so, yeah, we kind of know what a comet is, but, how big are they typically, and what are they made of, and how fast do they move, and when does that tail form? And so we just spent an hour on the phone talking about comets. I said,
Nice.
Wow. There's a nucleus, the big fuzzy part, that's a coma, that's like an extended atmosphere. It's, it's almost a perfect vacuum, but when you see it from a great distance, it's scattering all of this starlight, and et cetera, et cetera. And, the tail forms when you get about as close to the sun as Mars is, and, and they can be really long, and it's dust and gas. And they said, great, and then they took notes, and then when they wrote their first draft of the script, I just filled in the little detailed blanks about whatever they, whatever they were like, not sure about, like they wanted to have, oh, I'm picking up particles of blank, blank, and blank, in the tail. Okay, so, carbon dioxide, this, that, whatever it might have been. Another writer, Lisa Klink, called me for a Voyager episode, and she said, we've got this story where this much more advanced group of aliens is performing experiments on the crew of Voyager, and we don't know that they're doing it. We're like their lab rats, but we have no idea that this is going on. And she said, I thought it would be cool if while that's happening to our crew is studying some interesting astronomical phenomenon and doing their own sort of measurements and experiments. And she said, is there some cool thing that we've not seen on the show before? Something out in space that maybe a recent discovery, something that, because, we've obviously at this point, fourth season of Voyager or whatever, hundreds of episodes of Star Trek have been made.
A lot of space anomalies.
We've seen every spatial anomaly and every wormhole and, whatever else.
Gaseous cloud, and nebula.
And of course, I keep up with what's going on in the world of real science, just A, because I enjoy that, and B, because, it was kind of, I considered it part of my job, right?
Yeah.
And I'd been reading recently about the discovery of binary pulsars. So a pulsar is a neutron star. Star that at the end of its life has expelled its last remaining puffs of atmosphere and has collapsed in on itself because the nuclear fuel is exhausted. And if it's a big enough star, all of the protons get crushed into, and the electrons get crushed into neutrons, and it's just this big ball of neutrons, 7 or 8 miles in diameter. And if the star was spinning when it died, and they almost all do, then the spin speeds up. Like an ice skater, right? Doing a pirouette, and they're pulling their arms in, and so these things can spin hundreds of times a second, and they generate radio wave pulses along their magnetic field lines. Well, in the 90s, they started to discover pairs of neutron stars orbiting the same point in space, and that's called a binary pulsar. And the crazy thing about binary pulsars is that because they are such dense objects, they emanate gravitational waves as they orbit each other, and they lose energy through gravitational radiation. And that means that they will inevitably collide, and on a relatively short time scale compared to when something like that might happen with a pair of normal binary stars, right? And I told this to Lisa, and she said, oh, that sounds really cool. Tell me more. Well, so we talked about it. And, the executive producers liked it, and we worked that into the story. And then we had to kind of visualize it. And, we've never directly observed a neutron star in optical wavelengths. We detect them through radio waves, through their radio emissions, but we have some idea of what they might look like. And contrary to your intuition, they would actually be very bright. because their surface temperatures, especially if they're relatively young, a few million years old or something maybe. And again, this thermal inertia comes back to us. All of the heat generated by that core collapse can raise the temperature of these things to like 100,000 some odd degrees. So their surfaces are really, really bright white. But they're so small, 7 or 8 miles in diameter, I don't even think that the Webb telescope could see a neutron star if it was 20 light years away.
Oh, wow.
It's just not bright enough. It's not big enough to be that bright. But Voyager was going to be right on one of these things, within a few million miles or whatever, so that Janeway could observe the collapse, because she really wanted to see what happens, and get all the data that she could. And so I contacted a guy at Caltech. I looked up in the Caltech directory. There's a guy there named Sri Kulkarni, who's an astrophysicist who specializes in this stuff. And I told Dr. Kulkarni who I was, and I said, we're doing this episode, and we want to see a binary pulsar, and he said, "Oh, wow, that sounds great." And I said, would you be willing to help our art department, properly visualize this? Because I don't know what the orbital periods would be. I don't know if I could even calculate them. I'm sure you know this stuff inside out. And then what it might look like as they're spiraling together and stuff. So he worked with the art department to do those visuals. And that's the other thing that I would sometimes do. Like, I know next to nothing about medicine, but, my uncle's a surgeon, got a sister-in-law who's a doctor. And then I knew Narain had a friend who was a pathologist, Dr. John Glasgow, who's a great guy and had done consulting for TV and film, medical type stuff, and had actually worked with my uncle. When he heard my name for the first time, he said, "You related to a Dr. Peter Bormanis?" I'm like, "That's my uncle." "No, I worked with your uncle. He cut out a lymph node for me last week or whatever." Anyway, small world.
Yeah.
Right? So John was the source, of when I ran into something medical that I couldn't just get a term out of a textbook. It's just if the doctor needs to, if he just needs to say that the such and such bone in your arm is broken, well, that's easy enough to look up. But if it became a little more complicated than that, then I could turn to somebody like John, And there were various other people that I would consult with who had a specific kind of expertise we needed. But most of the time, 90% of the time, if not more, I mean, it's not like they're asking me to solve, cutting edge problems in quantum mechanics for these scripts, right? It's a combination of the Star Trek technobabble, as we lovingly call it, and real science, to the extent that real science makes sense in the stories.
Yeah, I think
was that Wake in Moments, that episode where they were experimenting on the crew without?
No.
Okay.
That in fact is an episode I wrote.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
But that was not that episode.
Okay.
That episode was called. What was it called? Scientific Method.
Okay.
Scientific Method. Yeah. Wow, I can't believe I remember that.
You were going to ask something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say I was also one of those kids that I had, the blueprints of the Enterprise D when I was a kid, and always was like, oh, okay, the Narcellus got to be back here because they put out the warp field and all the deflector dish. Of course, it all makes sense.
Yeah,
and it's like I've since a kid, I know what an M-class planet is. I couldn't tell you what the M stands for though.
Right.
I'm like, I know what an M-class is like, but and so those technical terms. They do mean. I mean, it's so funny because you kind of you're brought up with them. Even though it is pseudoscience in a way, but it's still like it feels as real as anything that we learn today.
Yeah. Well, I remember watching an episode in Next Generation, and I believe it might have been Geordi, and he was working with somebody on on a panel, and they were doing something, and I didn't know what it meant, but I was like, that sounds really cool. He became fascinated with this person or something, and she walks off, and kind of like in a flirtatious way, she's like, your neutrinos are wandering. And he's like, oh, and he's, because then you hear the panel start to kind of flash, like, oh, what are you doing?
Right.
And I had no idea what that meant. Your neutrinos were wandering. And I was like, I don't know what that means, but it sounds really cool, so it
just opens up your imagination.
Right, exactly, And I had heard that term before, neutrinos,
right.
Especially from Ninja Turtles. There's a group of people called the neutrinos on there, and that's the first time I heard.
Hilarious.
Yeah, and then I found out it was an actual science term, and I was like, "Whoa, that's amazing!" That's
coined by Enrico Fermi, who did the first controlled nuclear reaction.
Right.
He was an Italian, and when they were studying those, in the early days of studying nuclear reactions, they realized that the conservation of energy wasn't quite working out right on some of these reactions, like particle decays and so forth. And Fermi said, we're missing something. There has to be another particle that's carrying off that missing energy, a very small neutral particle. So he called it the little neutrino. And that's where that term comes from. And sure enough, that neutrino was discovered. And I forget the name of the guy who discovered it, but he won a Nobel Prize. So,
you had mentioned Dyson earlier.
Yeah.
And there was a Dyson sphere, on Next Generation where Scotty made an appearance. They had found him. Yeah. He was stuck in
a
transporter, right? Yeah.
Which they never really discussed, but I love it's like, so we've discovered immortality, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Because, we never...
Well, suspended animation.
Suspended animation,
yeah. But there's some people that believe like when you're transported, so your body gets disintegrated basically,
right.
and becomes data.
Yeah.
That gets and then you get reformed somewhere else. But is the original you? Are you still that original you?
Right.
Or is that like a clone basically with all your ideas? And if it is, and like. You could go to, your transporter buffer and bring up any pattern.
Yeah.
Could you come back as a younger you?
I have a better idea. Yeah. It's like when, and I might have thought of this in that episode when they bring Scotty aboard the Enterprise D, because
young Scotty.
Couldn't they have left 20 or 30 pounds of fat on the pad? I think the transporter would be the ultimate weight loss.
Oh my
It'd
God.
be better than Ozempic, right?
Exactly.
You wouldn't need to do you wouldn't need the holodeck Richard Simmons app.
Or if you want to make your nose a little smaller or something.
My God.
Plastic surgery.
Yeah.
Right.
I never thought about that. You're right.
No, but as suspended animation, I think, is, because that's the key to immortality, right? Because it's like, if they don't, in the next 20 years, come up with a cure for death. I'm in trouble, right? But, what a lot of people are doing is, people who've died of, the last 30, 40 years are, some of those bodies are stored in liquid nitrogen facility in Scottsdale.
Right.
And that is obviously done in the hope that not only will they be, resurrected sometime in the far future and restored to health, but if we can do that, even if medical science has not by that time found a quote-unquote cure for death, well, you can always put yourself back in the deep freeze and hope, keep your fingers crossed to the next time they thaw you out.
Thaw me out in 40 years. Let's see.
Maybe they'll have a way to do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Is that in layman's terms, is that possible, a Dyson sphere? I heard that it's not an actual structure, isn't, but maybe putting like satellites around an actual star to harness the power.
I think a solid shell would probably not be the smartest way to do it, and I think that was kind of, I don't know if that was Dyson's original conception of it. I don't know to what extent he thought through the engineering, but certainly the notion that if you want to efficiently utilize the resources of a solar system for the sake of creating a habitat for the greatest number of people in your civilization, that the thing to do is to take the planets, the asteroids, whatever other matter is available to you that you are willing to, sacrifice. Certainly we wouldn't take the Earth apart. I would hope not anyway. But there are plenty of other, bodies in our solar system that appear to be lifeless. And if nothing else, you could take the mass of the asteroid belt, which is only maybe 1/10 of the mass of the moon, but if not build an actual shell, build something like one of Larry Niven's ring world structures. And that's I think a very clever solution to the problem of finding more territory as your population expands. And I think Dyson ultimately he talked about it being maybe more of a framework, like a geodesic, sphere kind of a thing, that would still have an extraordinary amount of habitable area, right, and would utilize very efficiently constant sunlight for energy. And if you can overcome the technical hurdles, that's
Yeah.
certainly a great way to go.
I think don't they do something like that in Interstellar with the satellite world that when everyone kind of leaves Earth, they're on a kind of ring system.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that might be more of a rotating space station, like a Gerard O'Neill sort of a thing. Yeah, as opposed to surrounding a star.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Putting the star at the center.
Is there something when you see science fiction? What's your biggest pet peeve when you see science fiction films or TV? That just like that wouldn't. No, that's
Bill and Ted. You got it right.
Yeah.
Well, God, it's I don't like sloppiness. I don't mind creativity. I don't mind bending, stretching the rules. The movie Armageddon I thought was just very sloppy compared to Deep Impact.
Yeah.
They played fast and loose, and they tried to show some sort of artificial gravity on the Russian space station. It wasn't working right. It was in the wrong direction. They didn't understand centrifugal force,
Yeah.
or centripetal force in this case. But it's like that sort of stuff that bothers me. I don't mind. I don't mind setting aside my sense of disbelief. On some of these things.
Yeah, that movie in particular, you have to really,
but just don't treat me like I'm stupid.
Yeah. Right.
I never saw The Core. I doubt that I would have enjoyed that.
I love. It's a terrible watch, but it's one of my favorite bad movies to watch.
Yeah, right.
It's incorrigible.
Is that the one where they go? Yeah, they go into the core in that ship.
The core has stopped.
Oh, right. Yes.
And so they have basically a train, a big drill that drills down, and they're going to drop nuclear weapons.
That's
into
right.
the core.
That's right. I did see that.
Yeah. What else would you do?
Again.
Yeah.
Right. Of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's all we got.
Yeah.
Oh, but that movie's so terrible. But it's good.
I don't think I saw Geostorm either, which was another one of these. And then I know Brannon and I think maybe Brannon went with Sam Sagan. Sam Sagan, who's Carl Sagan's son, worked with us on Cosmos. Great guy, very good writer. We've become good friends. They like to go to those kinds of movies and and there was one that
just
came
laugh
out,
at the science.
Sam saw it. He may have seen it with Brannon. It came out fairly recently. It was something that the moon turned out to be hollow.
Moonfall.
Yes.
Yeah.
The moon was filled with AI.
Yeah. I did not see that.
Yeah.
And but they were both like, this is.
After this, we're going to do a bad movie marathon.
Hey, why not? No, but it's like, if it had been a good movie with that premise,
right,
then I can forgive a lot of it.
Right.
There were a couple of problems in Gravity, like something that bothered me, and I have to say, it sort of stuck with me. I thought it was a good movie. I thought Sandra Bullock was great, George Clooney very good, and it's really well done, really well shot. I mean, it's a very, very good, well-made movie. But the fact that she was able to go from ISS to the Hubble to some Russian thing with just her little jetpack.
Yeah.
Do you not understand the orbital dynamics here? That the space station is at an angle of 51 degrees relative to the equator, and and the Hubble is in a very, very different orbit, and you'll never get from one to the other with a little backpack, because the delta V is you're just way off the mark there.
Yeah.
I don't know why they felt like they needed to do that. And that kind of stuck in my science guy craw. But otherwise, no. I mean, I try to suspend my disbelief up to a point.
Yeah.
And if it's a good movie, if it's well made, I will not really even think much about whatever little technical errors I see. I do see them because I had to train myself to kind of pay attention to those things in a lot of ways. There was a bit that they used to do on the old Dave Letterman show called Limited Perspective. And I remember Letterman brought in this guy who was a dentist, and he was really a dentist. He was not an actor. He was not like, some comedian playing a dentist. He was a dentist. And they brought him in to review the movie Reds, the Warren Beatty movie about John Reed.
Yeah.
And they showed them, and Letterman like, so what did you think of the movie? Well, I had trouble getting through it. What was the problem? Well, Warren Beatty's dental work. 1920. Take a look, and then they bring up a scene where Warren Beatty is screaming or something, and you see
pearly
one of his
whites,
molars, and this dentist is like, "Do you see that molar?
That's
Do you
great.
see that?" They never would have done that
That's
way. You know?
great.
And it's like, you know, you can overdo it, right?
Sure.
And you know, I never wanted to overdo it.
Mhm.
I never wanted to like be such a nitpicker that you don't see the forest for
Yeah.
the trees. You know?
Was there ever anything that they approached you with that's like, I can't, I just, or this is going to be, aside from the planetary core one,
Yeah.
it says this is going to be very difficult. I don't know how I can make this
You know,
work.
the one thing I remember, there was a treatment
Mhm.
for a story. You know, back on Next Gen. Yeah, this was Next Gen. Typically, you know, the way that I did my job is I moved into an apartment in West LA, just outside of Santa Monica, and I was about 6-7 miles from Paramount.
Mhm.
I didn't have to go to the studio every day. I would have enjoyed that, but they didn't need me there. I didn't have an office, and I didn't want to make myself a nuisance, right? So the way it worked is they would just have a courier from the studio bring me the pages for that day.
Mhm.
And it was typically 4 or 5 days out of the week, somebody would show up at my door in the morning, and they would have that day's pages. And that day's pages might be a first draft script. Great. Oh, I get to read a script. Or it might be revisions on a script, you know, from a few weeks earlier. And it was like 1 act or 3 scenes or whatever. And, you know, I would see the word tech in parentheses in these pages, which was definitely my cue to, you know, fill in the blank, find the right word or language here. But I would read, you know, I would read everything. And, you know, if I saw something that was not marked for me and I thought I needed to make a note, I would make that note, right? And I would also get these story treatments. And typically back then, you know, when they bought a story from an outside writer or from one of their staff writers, first step would be, you know, they'd sit down in the writer's room and talk it through. And then that writer would go off and write like a 6 or 7 page sort of short story version of the episode.
Right.
And we call that a treatment.
Mhm.
So I would get the treatments for the episodes and read them so I know what the script's going to be about. You know, I could make sure that, oh, they're talking about something science-y here. I need to figure that out. You know, if it was
Right.
an area that I didn't know very well, I'd start to do some research or whatever. Well, I remember getting a treatment for a Next Gen script, and I forget which episode it might have been, but there was a so-called B story or a runner, which is one of the little subplots that they often have in a 1-hour episode. So while the main story is going on, maybe there's a little, you know,
Following a few characters over there.
Data has a bad tooth
Sure.
or whatever, and he keeps showing up in sick bay, you know, whatever it is. Something to cut to, as we
Yeah.
like to say, in between the main, you know, events of the A story. And so there was a runner in this episode that, oddly enough, involved Captain Picard was going to go on holiday, and he was looking forward to doing this trip on some planet that he would get into this specially outfitted kayak and ride these lava flows and lava tubes all the way to the core of the planet.
Oh.
Now, this is before the movie The Core. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm
stole some
I'm
ideas.
telling you. And I read that, and I'm like, ew. Again, Class M planet,
Yeah.
you know, 8,000 miles in diameter. Temperature at the core, very, very hot. You know, I don't
Yep.
care what your kayak is made out of. Not only that, but geophysically, I don't think there's any way that you could have lava tubes that would go all the way through the crust and the mantle and, you know, and not just
Right.
be crushed by,
Yeah.
Right.
you know, the tectonic forces that are always happening on a body like that. And also, it was Jules Verne. It was Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Sure.
And it was very, you know, it was just retro. And I'm like,
Yeah.
A, I think that's too retro. And B, I think that that's kind of absurd, you know,
Yeah.
from a geophysical perspective. So I, you know, when I read the treatment, I just wrote a little note and I said, you know, hey, great story. Love this. You know, I have a concern about the, you know, the B story with Captain Picard and the kayak. And, you know, if you'd like, we can discuss this. And I'm happy to come up with some alternatives, but I feel it's a little implausible. It also kind of feels a little too Jules Verne. And I wonder if you know, our audience really, you know, is going to buy that. And the next time I saw the treatment, that was just gone. So,
No.
that never happened. So, I suspect that they were not going to stick with that anyway. I don't know that my note made any difference. Narain Shankar, I think, was still on staff at the time, and he probably, when he read that, said something very similar. So,
It was probably Patrick Stewart going, I want a little cat.
Yeah.
This season.
Yeah. I really want to talk to you about your time on the Orville. How did you end up getting on the Orville, and what is your what do your duties entail being on the Orville? I know you're one of the writers, but you're also a science advisor on that as well.
Well, technically, it's funny. I think ER really kind of raised the bar back in the 90s. You guys saw the show.
Oh, loved it.
George Clooney, obviously,
Sure.
and Laura Innes, and great cast, and Michael Crichton, who was himself an MD. Graduated from medical school, and while he was doing that, wrote a novel called The Great Train Robbery, and I guess liked writing more than he liked practicing medicine. Who wouldn't?
Right.
At any rate, he created that show, and because it was. He knew that world.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to properly depict that world. And it was really the first medical show that I can remember that, had that level of authenticity and used that language without reservation, It was, in places hard to follow. And a lot of people, I'm sure, thought, oh, this is going to fall flat on its face, All I need is CBC, blood panel, blah, 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 whatever they're saying.
No.
It's gobbledygook, to most people. But, God bless them, they stuck with it and said, no, this is, the action and, the medical stories and the interpersonal relationships among our characters, that stuff, it's gonna go right past most of the audience, but there's really very little of it. And it lets the audience know these people know what they're doing, and that's what it sounds like when you're in the ER and they bring somebody in on a crash cart, or this, that, or the other, right? So he really raised the bar, and every season of that show, if I remember correctly, they had at least one MD on the writing staff. Law and Order, similar thing for the legal profession.
Sure.
Every season of that show, Dick Wolf was a lawyer. Every season of that show, they had at least one lawyer on the writing staff. L.A. Law. My friend Joe Renkmeyer, he went to law school. He didn't want to be a lawyer. He wanted to be a writer. He wrote for L.A. Law. He was a lawyer on the writing staff. And so, on the Orville, when Seth conceived of that show, he was, I think, vaguely aware of me because he had done a couple of guest spots on Enterprise. In between the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, and after I think 3 seasons of Family Guy, Fox pulled the plug.
Yeah.
But then a few years later, they brought it back because the DVD sales took off, and they did a couple of specials, and it became a thing. And Seth is a huge Star Trek fan, and David Goodman had written for Family Guy, and we brought him aboard Enterprise because we wanted to, bring some more humor into the show. And David was a huge Star Trek fan, knew Star Trek inside out, and great writer, great drama writer, as well as comedy guy, right? So he brought Seth, he said, hey, Seth, would really love to just have like one line down in engineering or something. Yeah. They met, he met Brandon and Seth hit it off. And so I met him at that time. And I remember Terry Metalis, who was Brandon's assistant back then, and went on to run Star Trek Picard, became a very good writer, ran 12 Monkeys, and he's great. And Terry just did a bang-up job.
Yeah, that's right.
But I remember at the time, Terry was a big Family Guy fan. He kept begging Seth to do one take as Stewie. Do one take in the Stewie voice. And Seth wouldn't do it. He said, no, you hired me to play an engineer. I'm not going to do Stewie. So at any rate, when the new Cosmos was being shopped around, Anne Druyan, Carl's widow, had worked with an astronomer named Steve Soder, who had worked with him on the original, and she and Steve had come up with a new, more modern version of Cosmos, and they were trying to get someone to produce it. And she had coincidentally met Seth at an event at the Smithsonian honoring Carl, and Seth loved the original Cosmos.
Oh wow!
And Annie said, "Well, I've been shopping it around, trying to get somebody interested. Not really getting any traction right now." And Seth was like, "Oh, you want it? new Cosmos. That would be amazing.
Mm.
Let me take it to Fox. Well, this was at a time when Seth was the goose that was laying the golden eggs,
Yeah.
and so he took it to Fox, and he said, "I think this is going to be great." And Fox agreed, and they liked Anne, and they liked Cosmos, and this had it took a while to get all of these pieces together, and by then I think Steve Soder had to move on to other things because he was still working as an astronomer, and Seth knew Brannon, and knew Brannon was a science fiction guy, and brought Brannon in to executive produce Cosmos. And then Brannon called me and said, "Hey, we're doing this new season." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I worship Carl." And
Yeah.
met him and Annie some years ago when they were touring with one of their books.
Wow.
And so he said, "Yeah, we need somebody, to help us with the technical aspects of this. The consultant, the guy that we had is, not available, and we want to make sure that we're doing this right, and we'll have other people, of course, weighing in." But he said, "Would you like to be involved with this as a consultant?" And I'm like, "Well, absolutely." So that's how I got involved in Cosmos. And then a year or two after that, I guess, was when Seth started pitching the Orville to Fox. And he hired Brannon and he hired David, and they both recommended me, and Seth knew he wanted somebody with a science background on the writing staff, as you would see on a show like an ER or a Law and Order, right?
Of course.
And he knew me and my background. We'd only met very briefly a couple of times. But they sent in one of my scripts to have him read, and he liked it, and then we met and we hit it off, and Brandon's like, we should bring Andre on board, and so the first season, I think I was a supervising producer, which is just the ranks of the writers, right? You start in your writing career in television, you start as a staff writer, then the next promotion is story editor. You get a little more money, you get a per episode fee. Then executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-executive producer, and then finally executive producer. So I'd been a supervising producer on, I think, a couple of other shows at that point, and so they brought me on as a supervising producer, but they also gave me a science consultant title in the end credits to supplement my pay,
right?
Which was nice, but it's like, well, I haven't been a science consultant since Star Trek days, or I guess really that first season of Cosmos. I think that was my title as well. But at any rate, then I became a co-executive producer on seasons 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And I think they dropped the science consultant bit, because it's like, it's understood that I will handle those duties.
Many hats.
Sure.
But I'm there to write, and to be in the writer's room and to break stories and to write scripts. So.
What are some of the biggest differences between writing for Star Trek and writing for the Orville? Are there many differences, or?
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's a different it's a different cast. It's a different vibe. It's I think it's probably more character oriented in a lot of ways.
Sure.
The relationships between the characters are more sort of front and center because, of course, Ed is, his ex-wife is the first officer,
So
and
good.
Claire has a couple of kids, the doctor, right, and then the Isaac character, is now in a relationship with Claire, and so I think that element of it is unique to the Orville, and I think that's all Seth, and he created those characters and had a very clear vision of what he wanted that show to be at that level. But it's also, I think, one of the reasons that Seth created the Orville is he missed that kind of storytelling on TV. The last 10, 12 years or whatever, everything has become serialized. Very little episodic television.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very little even high-concept science fiction.
Yeah.
Seth missed seeing those high-concept science fiction stories that were, the standard on, the original series, Voyager, Next Gen, DS9. Now, DS9 and Enterprise, of course, explored, these multi-season arcs. And, we moved in that direction in the late 90s and early 2000s to some degree. But ultimately, that idea of, one episode, one story, high concept science fiction, some kind of a morality tale, something that had a point, was what Seth was looking for. And I know I don't watch too many of the newer Star Treks. I think I've seen episodes from pretty much all of them. And, some things I like, some things I don't like as much. But it's also kind of gone down that serialized
very much
storytelling format, with the exception of Strange New Worlds.
Yes.
Which I started watching because, I can watch one and not have to, worry about, I mean, sure, it helps to know the background to those characters, and that Pike has a history of number one, and that Spock is now having him, some sort of.
Are the Orville writers watching that going like, hey, now, wait a minute, we just, you guys are just taking our stuff now.
Yeah.
No.
Not really, although, I did notice way back in one of the earlier seasons of Discovery, we did a couple of very funny scenes in the elevators on the Orville.
Yeah.
And then Discovery did
you guys are beating them to the punch. Yeah.
A funny elevator scene, awkward elevator moment thing. So that was like, okay, well,
Was it hard? I mean, coming up with a new science fiction concept like the Orville, obviously you can see where the DNA is, right?
Yeah.
You can, but it's it must be kind of freeing in a way because you're not shackled with that Roddenberry continuity.
Yeah,
like you can kind of do things whatever you want in the show.
Right, and there is there is conflict between our characters.
Yeah,
I know they do that now in the in the newer shows, but Roddenberry,
that was a big deal.
At least in Next Gen, he was very much, this is all kumbaya on the ship.
Yeah.
The conflict comes from outside.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that's a very nice idea, kind of utopian, but it's hard from a dramatic perspective.
Well, that's what I loved about DS9. DS9 really did a 180 on that, and they went the other way. It's like, well, the Federation has to do what it has to survive and to defend its planets.
Yeah.
Armin Shimmerin was here. I interviewed him.
Great, yeah.
He was in that same.
Armin,
he was in that same chair, and I talked to him about because Deep Space Nine that's my favorite Star Trek series, and there's a scene in there where Sisko has pretty much murdered the Romulan senator, the Romulan representative, and blamed it on the Dominion because they're in war with the Dominion. And he's admitting everything to the computer. He's like his log. And then at the very end of the episode, he says, "Delete that entire log." And he holds his drink up and he says, "I did what I had to do."
Wow.
And to bring the Romulans into the war,
because
they're losing the war.
That was huge.
Which was huge. And at the time, I remember watching. I think it was like 97, 98. And I was in high school, and I was very much mesmerized by the kumbaya. Roddenberry. No, the Enterprise is angelic and perfect.
Right. I love playing poker.
So I saw that, and I was like, "What the hell?" I was like, "Whoa!" And I was just floored by it. And I loved it.
It was a very different model of storytelling,
right.
And certainly for dramatic 1-hour television. Right?
Yeah.
But it certainly worked in that context, but it was very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think that with the newer shows, they realized that was not going to be sustainable.
Yeah.
The world has changed. That, the kinds of shows that audiences are interested in.
Right.
Are serialized. They do have that kind of interpersonal conflict among the main characters and so forth. And
and it doesn't have to be bleak. I feel like a lot of people think like, oh, we got to go dark and depressing, or like dystopic with any kind of future stuff. And I'm I love original series stuff. Is like I like an idea of like we can all get along in the future at some point. But but it does. You're right. It takes away a lot of character development if you don't have those conflicts.
Well, and I'll tell you the one thing that I do miss and again, I've not watched every episode of the new shows. I think I saw all of, I did see all of season 3 of Picard, and I think I've watched.
Perfect.
We were very excited when that came out.
It was amazing.
Yeah, and then I've seen.
We're like, they got it right.
Yeah, and I've seen. I think most of Strange New Worlds, but the idealism of the original series is what I find missing, and I find very kind of depressing, just because of the state of the world as it is today, and the state of the world that I expected it to be when I was growing up and watching Star Trek, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I thought really kind of illustrated that is these episodes that they've done on Strange New Worlds with the Gorn.
Mm-hmm.
The Gorn it's Alien, right? I mean, they're like the Alien characters from those old
Right.
Ridley Scott movies, and the Gorn on the original. Well, the whole point of that episode, I think, from a thematic perspective, was Kirk is out for revenge. These bastards, they killed everybody on this outpost ruthlessly.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to go after them. He's going to make them pay.
Mm-hmm.
And we find out they're these kind of awful, literally cold-blooded, reptilian kind of creatures.
Right.
But then, when Kirk, gets, and the Gorn captain get, stopped in their tracks by the Metrons and beamed down to this planet where they have to engage in combat, Kirk, he says, I have to remind myself, this is not a monster. This is a starship captain like myself. And, it's a fight to the death, and he knows that to save his ship, he's got to kill this guy, And, of course, it finally gets to the point where
So
Kirk's
good.
got him by the throat, and he's got his,
Got the rock.
his crystalline dagger or whatever. And he's going to, he's got a little smile on his face, and he's going to, cut his throat open. And then he's like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Throws it aside. No, I'm not going to kill him. I'm not going to be your entertainment, Fuck you guys.
Yeah.
Can I say that on your
yeah,
podcast?
we cuss,
absolutely.
we
I'm
cuss.
sorry.
Yeah, we cuss all the time. Yeah.
Okay.
He's like, in that case.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of a funny Terry Farrell story. I
Yeah.
can tell you in a moment. But,
Please.
and
Like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is the biggest potty mouth.
But then, the Metron is like, wow, I didn't expect that. You showed compassion for an enemy. He would not have done that for you. I can guarantee you that, right? That was what made that a great episode.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because if it had ended with, Kirk killing the Gorn and the Metron saying, all right, you won, but, don't be an asshole in the future, it wouldn't have been as powerful.
Yeah.
Right.
And that seems to be like, well, why did you turn the Gorn into that? Why not just create a new alien species?
Right. Yeah.
Why call them the Gorn?
Right.
Not only that, but it's a continuity error.
Right.
Kirk was the first to encounter the Gorn, not Pike.
Exactly.
That bugs me, all right?
Yeah,
no,
as
exactly,
a hardcore
yeah.
Trek nerd, that
Yeah.
bugs me. So.
Yeah, I mean, Discovery certainly has a lot of problems. I mean, there's an episode in there where an Enterprise captain tortures somebody
Yeah,
to death.
yeah.
And I'm just like, and I remember watching that. It's like, this is not,
Yeah.
I don't know what the hell this is.
Yeah.
It's not, it doesn't seem like Star Trek to me.
Yeah, it's like, well,
You know?
what's the point of doing that?
Right,
I don't
you know?
understand. Any show can do that.
Right,
They did it on
exactly,
24.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why would Star Trek go down that road?
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
get
and
it,
that was
you
always
know?
what, especially as a kid growing up watching Star Trek, that's what always held the Federation captains up to a much higher standard than everybody
Right,
else,
right,
because they considered the fact that, yeah, that's my enemy, but that doesn't mean that I can't show compassion
right.
Right.
to them.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and funny thing about the Gorn is like Voyager already did that. Like Voyager did better with was it Species
8472.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
I'm like
In fluidic space. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fluidic space.
Yeah.
exactly. It's like you guys did it already and,
Yeah.
and did it better. So
Right.
Yeah. Terry Farrell story, please. Yeah.
She's great,
Yeah.
and I remember this was going back to my science consultant role. I remember I did notes on a script that Michael Piller had written for Deep Space Nine, where Sisko and O'Brien and a couple of other people were down on a planet, and they discovered that their instruments weren't working. The communicators, the tricorders, the phaser. There was some kind of general energy dampening field or blah, 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 something around. So Michael had written this in the script. And naturally I saw the word tech in parentheses when, O'Brien, Colin Meaney's character, is describing why his theory of how he thinks, what he thinks is causing this problem. And I thought, okay, they're on a Class M planet, what could be going on? I thought, well, we have to, shield electronics against certain kinds of natural radiation. Certainly out in space you do. Here on the surface of the Earth, not as important because we've got a magnetic field that protects us from cosmic rays and things. And I thought, well, maybe there's something about the core of this planet, back to planet cores, that the electrically charged fluids circulating the core are so strong and so powerful that they're creating this fluctuating magnetic field that our instruments aren't shielded against, and that's why they're constantly fritzing out and breaking down. So I had O'Brien saying something about, Captain, I believe that there is that the core of this planet is generating a high-frequency, rapidly fluctuating electromagnetic field that's penetrating the shielding of our instruments, right? Well, so poor Colomini had to say this 5 or 6 times in the script,
Yeah.
Well, it must be that damn rapidly oscillating electromagnetic field. And so I get back those pages a few days later after I'd sent him my notes. And Michael had written in the margin, every time I said that, NGE. NGE, what the hell is that? So I called Jerry Taylor. I said, hey, Jerry, I got my, some notes back from Michael. I'd written some, tech stuff here. And in the margin of the script for that, he wrote NGE. What does NGE mean? She said, oh, not good enough. Like, oh, geez. I guess I better come up with something else. And that's when it kind of dawned on me that, oh, my God, poor Colomini has to say this like X many times. It's a mouthful. And so I came up with the notion of the duonetic field. The planet is generating a duonetic field, and it's interfering with our instruments. On the original Star Trek, you might recall, they used duotronic circuits in the circuitry of the computer systems on the Enterprise. And in the episode The Ultimate Computer, when Dr. Daystrom brings in his multitronic unit, that was a leap beyond duotronics, right? Because on the original Star Trek, Roddenberry thought, well, saying electronic circuits is going to make it sound primitive. We can't call this electronics.
Yeah.
There was a fun line in the Space Seed episode where we first meet Khan, where Scotty's looking at this old ship from the 1990s and saying, "Oh, it's amazing! They've got these circuits, Captain. I think they used to call them transistors. I'd love to tear this baby apart, right?" So I get it, right? Duotronics and then multitronics. So I thought, so if there are duotronic circuits, there are probably duonetic fields. So that was my little nod to the original series, and a nice, compact, invented word. Yeah. Again, another fig leaf that nobody could write me a letter and say, hey, you know what? A rapidly fluctuating electromagnetic field, my cell phone would work in that. So I wasn't going to get caught up in that, right? Yeah. Well, so...
Luckily, this was all before Reddit.
Yeah.
It would rip it all apart now.
Oh, my God, yeah. God, who knows? But I was at the, I think the first... my first year working on Star Trek was final season of Next Gen and second season of DS9. So I got invited to the DS9 wrap party.
Oh, nice.
I was very excited.
Nice.
So I get there, and there's Ira Bear, and there's, Colomini, and, some of the people I'd interacted with a little bit, but they, didn't really know who I was. Had some idea. The writers knew who I was, not the actors so much. And then I see Terry Farrell. And she was just standing by herself somewhere, wherever this thing was held, And, I had a drink. She had a drink. So I'll walk over and say hi to Terry Farrell. And so I walked over. And, she's very beautiful. Yeah. She's tall. She's, I'm very average height for a man of my era, my age. She's probably a couple inches taller than me. So a little intimidating, right? So I walk over and I said, "Oh, hi, Miss Farrell. Hi, my name is Andre Bormanis." "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. You're on the show." And what do you do on the show? And I said, "Well, I should apologize." I said, I'm the guy who puts all of that terrible technobabble in your dialogue. I'm the science consultant. She looks at me like I just, told her I was a serial killer or something. She grabbed me by my lapels, almost pulled me off my feet, got right in my face and said, "You fucking asshole," and just shook me. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry.
Every actor's worst nightmare.
And then she just laughs. I'm just pulling your leg. And I'm like, oh, okay. But then she told me, and this was something I wish I'd been told this when I started. I wish I'd gotten a little, science consultant, do's and don'ts, list from somebody when I started. But she said, if I'm sitting, on the set talking to the computer and I'm by myself, happy for you to put as much of that technobabble in my dialogue as you think is appropriate. But she said, if I'm in a scene with a couple of other people and the scene is about something more than, some little scientific detail or whatever.
Right.
And I need to hit my marks and I need to know what this scene is about and I need to know what the other characters are feeling or thinking and what the dynamic is, then it's like really hard for me on top of all of that to remember a lot of technical language that I don't understand at all.
Right.
Because, most of the actors would just sort of memorize it phonetically because they didn't know, what even a term like duonetic, that didn't mean anything to Colomini. I don't think he watched the original, or if he did, he probably didn't remember duotronics, right? So duonetic, and, the same with Brent Spiner, who I had the chance to work with again on a show called Threshold, which was great, and got to be better friends with Brent. Used to see him we'd go to the same gym for a while, which was fun. Hey, Brent, how's it going? But, I when Terry told me that, I was like, oh, from then on, I made sure that, what is this scene about? How much can I really give them without them feeling like, oh, this is going to be a nightmare, to get through this in 3 takes or whatever they might have. So, that's the kind of thing that is also part of that job, right?
Sure.
So, as my science nerd, hat was, pressing down on my head, I had to consciously remind myself that I'm giving lines to actors who don't know anything about this terminology and are trying to memorize it phonetically, or maybe it makes some sense to them if it's some real science thing that they maybe heard of or whatever, So
Yeah. How often did you visit the sets? Did you get to go on set for Next Generation? I'm asking because I would have wanted to sit in the chair.
Oh yeah, I didn't dare sit in the chair. I did go to the set a few
I would have
times.
gotten fired for it. I'd be like, well, I'm gonna chance it. I'll get fired.
I
Get blacklisted out of Hollywood real quick.
Would have been worth it.
Yeah, right. I got to go a few times, not that often. I was, a visitor.
Sure.
I didn't need to be there.
Yeah.
On rare occasions, actors would call and ask me a question about, some of the science language in the script. I remember Max Grodenchik, who played Rom on DS9. Great guy, really nice guy. And I'd invented a term for an unstable chemical compound. It was chemocyte. It was some illicit shipment of something or other.
Sure, when they went back in time, right?
I think so, yeah. I think that was it.
They went back in time to Roswell.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Oh, yeah, it was the Roswell episode.
1940s,
Yeah, that was a fun episode.
All right, that was good.
They had to vent it, and it somehow created a time warp.
Yeah, but Max called me all...
I love these.
Max called me all concerned. He said, oh, Andre, I got the script, and, you've got this thing called, is it chemocyte or chemocyte? And I said, oh, it's chemocyte, not chemocyte, chemocyte. Oh, okay. You should, okay. Yeah, be sure to say that, Oh, thanks. It's like, I totally made it up.
Yeah.
And did it really matter whether you said chemocyte or chemocyte? Well, no. But I didn't like chemocyte because it sounded too much like chemical.
Right.
And even though it was a chemical I didn't want it to sound like chemical.
Right.
Because I thought that's going to sound a little false. It's going to ring. It's going to be a little flaky sound.
Right.
I don't know.
It's very like 1950s science fiction when it's just like
Chemical
X,
Right. And so you also worked on. I know Watson wants to ask you about this. You also worked on Tron.
Tron Uprising.
Yeah. Get ready for another 2.5 hours. No,
part 2.
Massive Tron fan.
I mean, I was obviously as a kid. I had that VHS, and I played that thing till it. Till I don't know. It's something about that whole world of being able to be like inputted into a computer and play the games. I was fascinated with as a kid, and
it was pioneering in its day, and it was very
and visually too. I mean, just gorgeous the way. I mean, using technologies that weren't done at that time, and revolutionary with 3D animation and everything like that. I mean, it really like just captured me as a kid. And I, when Tron Legacy came out, I was a big fan of it. I know that it did okay. Not, and we're still waiting for a third one. I keep hearing rumbles.
I went to school with Bo Garrett, who was in that. Tron Legacy, one of the actresses, nicest person in the world, But sorry.
But then and then the show Uprising, which was a prequel to Legacy, right? It was the oh man, no, forgot the name of the group. The
in the garage.
Yeah.
The Gang in the Garage, I've forgotten as well.
I know it's been a while, but I love the show. And then it's one of those things that again I'm like, how did you, going from science fiction background and stuff? I mean, was it an easy transition to get into that show, or was it this is like me flexing another muscle for that?
No, it was it's storytelling is storytelling ultimately, and I think that I treated it just like I would treat, being on a 1 hour drama with the same, the same premise and the same characters. And I'd never done animation before. I thought it was really cool. I thought the artwork was great. Yeah. Charlie Bean, I think, was our director. And Adam Kitsis and Eddie, God, my memory. Eddie Kitsis and Adam Horowitz, Kitsis and Horowitz, who had done some work, I think, in Star Wars, maybe. At any rate, they created the show, and then they wrote the pilot, got the ball rolling, and then I think they turned it over to another person as the showrunner. But I got to meet those guys, and they liked a couple of lines in one of the scripts that I wrote, and I was like, oh, that's cool.
Nice.
But I'll tell you, there is not much difference in writing for animation in this sense. I thought, I'm going to be doing an animated show. I can make up any stuff that I want.
Right. Yeah,
I can imagine the craziest, environments, oh my God, we've got all of cyberspace to explore, what can we do, and da-da-da-da-da. Well, what I discovered, and what maybe in retrospect should have been kind of obvious, is that we had really most of the same constraints that we did on any other show that I'd worked on. Oh. Star Trek, Threshold, 11th Hour. It was, there was always not enough time and not enough money.
Oh, wow.
And we had the same kind of deadlines for scripts. We had the same kind of production deadlines. The actors did voiceover; they weren't on set. But we had the main character's garage was kind of our big
the hub kind of
the hub. That was the bridge of the Enterprise. That was our big standing set. Right, that's where a lot of the action took place, and we had to try to use that as much as possible, because just like the bridge of the Enterprise or any other,
because they had that model.
They had that model built and rendered in great detail, and that took a lot of time and cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so it's like, always try to use the standing sets if you can. So Tron Uprising, like any other show, had certain standing sets. And if we wanted to go out on a limb and describe some new environment, we had to really look closely at the budget and the money and the time and decide whether or not we can do that. Or if we did, all right, well, maybe we can do that, but then we need to move some other stuff back into the garage, because, we can't afford to do that and some other new set.
That is a weird thought of, like, because you do think like animation, like, this is going to cut. What is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's easier.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It takes it takes a lot of processing time, which of course costs a lot of money to render those scenes. So even in the garage, we have all the walls and we have the light cycles up on a rack or whatever. Yep. But you got the characters moving around and their mouths are moving, and that takes time and money. You gotta block them, and you got to do that inside this environment that you've created and move things around, and it is no small task. And I got a real appreciation for that working on that show.
What was the turnaround from script writing to actually seeing a finished episode when dealing with animation?
Yeah, gosh. Longer than for live action television.
Really?
Yeah, certainly for the Star Trek shows I worked on, and for the network shows. Like I did two shows for CBS, Threshold and 11th Hour. Neither of them sadly went a full season, but those shows had a quicker turnaround time.
Oh wow.
I don't remember exactly what it was on Tron Uprising, but I know it was months. Wow. And I'm just trying to remember. I did that show in 2011 or 12. Yeah. I forget when we started writing it, but it was around that time. And then I don't know that it aired. It probably didn't air before the end of the year when we were writing it. I can't remember now.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember as well, because I think it came out fairly soon after the movie came out, after Legacy came out. So I don't know how much you guys got to be involved in the movie. Like, did you get to see it before writing any of the shows? Like, was there any? Because I know it was kind of like a direct handoff from that. So.
Yeah, I know Kitsis and Horowitz did, and I think we might have seen a screening. I know I saw it. I can't remember if I saw it before at on the lot, at Disney,
right.
or I just knew what the contours were and knew what the setup was, and and that became the pilot script that Kitsis and Horowitz wrote. Was kind of the springboard for the series in our minds, and I'm sure we were aware of the larger story, of Legacy if we had not actually seen it. We probably saw it. They probably screened it for us before we really got into the nitty-gritty of writing it.
Yeah, because something like that, and like you said, like animation takes so long to, and I'm sure, I mean, everything, your script has to be completely polished and ready to go before any kind of animation is put into it, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It's not one of those things where you can go, well, we can go back and do the little extra bit here and what have you.
Yeah, there was always some concept art that was going on, as we were writing, and I think that up to a point you could make changes, but at some point you got to lock it, and we probably locked those scripts, much sooner than we would have had to if it were a live action show.
Is animation something you'd want to get back into, or?
Oh, I'd do it again. We did it on Cosmos, for their historic recreations.
Yes, yeah.
And that was fun.
Yeah.
But that was, also, a different kettle of fish. It was just, you're writing a scene and you're just writing a scene. How that scene is executed, whether it's an animation or on live action on a set. We actually did an interesting hybrid on the first post-Carl season of Cosmos, which we call season 2, since the original is season 1.
Yeah.
But we... there was an episode that Annie had written with Steve Soder about the life of Michael Faraday. And Faraday was an amazing, physicist, an amazing human being. I knew a little bit about his life outside of his physics, and Faraday's law and all of that jazz, which I learned in college, of course. But and when you're a physics major, at a university, and I don't know if this has changed at all, or maybe some universities are different, like St. John's. In Santa Fe, and I think they have a campus in Annapolis, but you rarely learn much about the history of the science. There may be a sidebar in a textbook, and you may know, Michael Faraday lived from so-and-so, such and such a year to such and such a year in London in the 19th century or whatever, but that's about as much as you'll get. Well, I didn't realize, how much he had done and what humble roots he came from and how he just, managed to worm his way into a job working for Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institute. But we one of the things that we explored in describing his amazing contributions to science was his discovery of something that we now call Faraday rotation. Michael Faraday discovered that polarized light, light oscillates, electromagnetic field.
Yeah.
It oscillates at a particular angle. The electric waves can be going vertically, and the magnetic waves going horizontally, and they can rotate through different angles, and that's what we mean by polarization. Polarized sunglasses only let in light coming through at one angle, and that's how they reduce glare and so forth, right? So what Faraday had discovered doing experiments with electromagnets and crystals was that a magnetic field can twist the polarization of light. So there's a form of polarization called circular polarization. And he found by shining light through a crystal that was mounted in an electromagnet that the application of the magnetic field would change the polarization of the light.
Wow.
Really cool. Really
Yeah.
cool. An amazing discovery. I would not have guessed if you had told me or asked me to guess. When did physicists discover that, polarized light, that the angle of polarization could be changed by a magnetic field? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
1940.
Right.
I would have guessed much later, right? Well, so that was amazing, and and we had this scene where we're demonstrating this, and it was one of the animation scenes. So Annie and Stephen had written it, and I worked with Brandon. Oh, here's what we're going to have to show. We got to show an electromagnet that looks like a kind of a round piece of metal with a coil around it, and blah blah blah. And we described all of this as best we could for the animators and handed that to the animators, and they were like, "We don't know what the heck you're talking about here. What do we see? Where's the light coming from? Where's what is this? What is that?" And it's like, God damn, it's really hard,
Yeah,
it's like
kind of high concept
stuff. I had to really think about it, and then I'm like, I don't know exactly how to put this down on paper. I'll try, and then I don't know who it was. I can't remember now. Somebody came up with a brilliant idea that, well, here's what we'll do. Describe it in very broad strokes on the page. And we shot most of our sort of standing set Spaceship of the Imagination stuff for Cosmos in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We had sound stages up there. And so they said, we're gonna do Michael Faraday on set. I want you to go to this prop guy and have him build a prop 19th century electromagnet and a Nicole prism and a this, that, and the other, and and a little battery pile, circa 1850 or whatever, and then we're going to have you take that stuff up to New Mexico, and we're going to put it on a table, and we're going to put you in a little Michael Faraday coat, and you're going to do the experiment. And then we will use a process called rotoscoping to turn that,
speaking of Tron,
physical action into animation.
Yeah.
That's like, well, that's
brilliant.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Makes it easy. So I went up for a few days, and we had the props, we had the table. I set it up. One of our assistant directors, directed the scene, figured out a couple of different angles, to illustrate the concept, and then they had me do the experiment. So I put on a coat, and the
so
lab.
that's you in the scene.
That's me in the scene. Well,
your body anyway.
Well, kind of. I was the model.
Yeah, it's
and
basically
they used
motion capture. In a way.
Brandon's face was actually a pretty good facsimile for Michael Faraday. He looked strikingly like Faraday,
funny.
And they used him in a portrait of Faraday in another part of that episode. But so at any rate, so I you see me, setting up the electromagnet, putting the little tray with the crystal in it, and then lining up a little optical device for looking at polarization of light, and then there's a battery connected to the electromagnet, and then they have a close-up of me pressing the little, the little pedal switch sort of thing for the battery power, and then squinting into the eyepiece, and seeing the electromagnetic.
So did you get a line in though?
No.
So you would have got the SAG card.
Yeah.
I know. I was so close. I should have said, "My God,
Eureka!"
Yeah.
But so that was cool, and that was that was great fun.
Yeah,
and that was in it. It's rotoscoping was. I had been around for a while, I guess, by the time we did Cosmos. So it wasn't exactly cutting edge,
right?
Sure.
But it was one of several things we did that way.
Yeah,
because it's just not so easy to describe in words.
Yeah,
and try explaining that to somebody who's going to just do animation from scratch.
Right.
It's not easy.
It was just drawn like a Tesla coil or something like that.
That's
the best we can do.
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah.
But it's just a car that they drew. And finally, I have to ask you about Oppenheimer because it's right up your alley.
Oh,
yeah.
Sexy! Talk about sexy scientists.
Yeah,
Yes.
it'd be a crime to let you go without asking you about Oppenheimer. What did you think about the movie itself and just how they portrayed him and the people who worked around him? What did you think? From
very
a scientist's
good.
perspective.
Oh, very, very good.
Yeah.
Definitely, a solid A. I knew the history of the Manhattan Project and the bomb itself pretty well.
Right.
I had a less clear understanding of how he lost his security clearance and that guy who was up for a Secretary of Commerce job and whatever, who was kind of gunning for him.
Yeah.
That story I didn't know.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
I didn't know that story, and I thought that was very interesting, the most interesting part to me. It was, I think there were people who criticized the fact that it was a very male perspective, which at the time, sure, it was mostly men, but there were a couple of women in key positions who you kind of see them in the background, but they didn't really, they didn't really kind of bring them into the story maybe as much as they could have. Who am I to second guess, Christopher Nolan? I thought he did a brilliant job directing it. I thought it was one of these things that's such a challenge because you kind of know the end of the story, right? You know the bomb's going to work. And it's going to work at that first Trinity test.
Yeah.
But he managed to really keep the suspense alive and to really make it, feel palpably like you were there.
Right. I just loved, there was that one shot where you see everyone's reaction to the test and how there's people that are elated that it happened. Yeah. There's people that are crying that it's happened.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, yay, we did it. Oh, now what? It's so good. And it's just such a little moment.
Yeah.
But, Yeah,
and very much that was the real history of it, because, a lot of people, you're focused on a goal and you want to achieve that goal and you think that, the future of civilization is at stake and you know what the Nazis are capable of.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily think through the ramifications of what if we're successful and they actually use the damn thing.
Right.
And, I think that there's a scene where you see somebody who's presumably Richard Feynman playing some bongos and celebrating. Well, my recollection is that he did do that, and he felt kind of an elation when the thing worked, because they were scientists focused on a problem, and it's like it was all theory, and then suddenly, oh my God, we were right, and it worked, But he said in subsequent weeks and months, he started to become very depressed. He felt very depressed about it. Not that he felt regret. He didn't regret being involved, and I don't know exactly how he felt about the fact that those two bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but he definitely was depressed about the fact that humankind had developed this extraordinary capability that for the first time in our history could really end civilization as we know it. And I think that Nolan did a great job of that, the import of that and how that was felt by people like Oppenheimer and Einstein, but I very, very good. Very, very good. If there were any little technical details that I felt were wrong, I've forgotten them. So I doubt that there was anything significant.
I have to have a Joe Rogan moment here and ask you about aliens.
Yes.
It's something I've wanted to ask you for a while.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think it's plausible that we've been visited? Because now, and I'm asking because now the Pentagon has released a lot of information lately saying, well, we've run into something. We don't really know exactly what it is. We don't know how upfront they're being with us, but they have said we're running into something.
Interdimensional archaeologists.
Yeah. And naval pilots have come out and said, we chased this. They call it the Tic Tac. The UFO that looks like the shape like a Tic Tac, but can move without any kind of means of propulsion. They can't catch up to it. It can take off. It can execute these turns in the air that they've never seen before. What do you think is going on? From your educated.
You asked me, is it possible? Is it plausible? Chris Black, who is a great friend and a good writer, terrific writer, and was a writer-producer on Enterprise for 3 years, and that's how we met and became pals. He's now the showrunner on Monarch. Hello.
Yeah.
And did Severance. So if you want to talk to Chris sometime,
I love Severance. Yes, absolutely.
At any rate, Chris used to tease me for various things when we were working on Star Trek. He would say, there have been times when I've gone to Andre and I said, I would ask him some kind of, science question, some techie thing about, could we do this on the ship or this, and he would say, is that plausible? And Andre would say, is it plausible? Yeah, I guess it's plausible.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of how I guess I feel about, these most recent sightings. Is it possible that could be some kind of alien technology? It's possible. How likely is it? Well, I really have no idea. I don't think that's something that anybody can gauge.
Mhm.
It's a phenomenon of some kind that we don't yet understand. This is cutting edge technology. I do know a little something about infrared sensors because I was a research assistant for an infrared astronomer when I was in grad school for a year or so. And, I think that you have to really go through a lot of other possibilities and eliminate them in a convincing way before you even get to the point of saying, well, this may be something that is not of this earth, right? I've heard people talk about, if a pilot in an F-16 is flying at 30,000 feet and the sun's in a certain place and they see a very bright light on the horizon and they're not sure what it is and they train the infrared on it and they see this thing, and it's like, holy fuck, what's that, Well, could that be a commercial airliner 30 some miles away at a higher altitude that's right on the horizon, and the only thing you can see is some heat emission from its engines, and it's so far away that the two engines or the four will look like one? I don't know. Mark Kelly, who's an astronaut and a fighter pilot, retired fighter pilot, he said, there were problems with something called gimbal lock on these sensors that can create these spurious, images on the infrared screen. And, a pilot sees that and then they look out the window and they're wondering what they might be seeing. And it's like, there's a psychological component to it. I don't know. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe the commercial airliner 30 some miles away, just about to go over the horizon, is wrong. I don't know that means that, therefore it must be something that's, completely beyond our, technology beyond our comprehension.
Right.
There's spoofing, there are always all sorts of ways to spoof sensors, I don't know if that's possible with these, sensors on these aircraft. I think it's really compelling. I'm glad people are taking it seriously. I'm glad they're looking at this. I'm glad people like Avi Loeb at Harvard, who probably goes a little too far out on the limb on, entertaining some of these more exotic possibilities. But hey, I'm glad he's setting up these arrays of sensors in various places around the world to constantly monitor the near sky to see if there is anything, And, there are potentially atmospheric phenomena that we don't know about that, years and years ago, people would report seeing these things, like right on the edge of the atmosphere, that there would be these sudden flashes and, oh my God, what's that? It looks like it's ascending and, Well, from space, we finally started recording these so-called blue sprites, and they're kind of electrical phenomena in the upper atmosphere, and they're very elusive and very hard to see. And it's only since we've developed powerful sensors and have so many of them in space that we're starting to see them regularly and understand what they are. And so I'm hopeful that maybe by gathering more and more of these observations, and I think they should, and I think pilots should report this stuff, that we'll get somewhat better of an idea of, when they might be spotted, what kind of readings we can get. Can we get spectra? Can we get other kinds of data? And you know what? I don't rule out the possibility, and, even, the idea of crash sites, some people, astronomers, if they had the technological capability to travel, dozens, maybe hundreds of thousands of light years across space, you really think we're going to see them? They're going to crash and blah.
Right.
Well, you know what? If somebody from 200 or 2,000 years ago witnessed a space shuttle launch, they'd say, you're godlike, oh my God, this is insane, and yet, we blew up 2 of those things too, right? No matter how advanced your technology, I don't think that, at least if it's informed by the kind of science that, that we have and have some reason to believe is sort of universal, doesn't mean you're infallible, right?
Murphy's Law is always going to be in a
so, it's like, I will not, I won't rule it out, and I would love it to be true, and I'm fascinated. And I want them to keep looking at it. So I would hope that, maybe in the next 10, 20, 30 years, with SETI and, Breakthrough Listen and some of these other programs, and, more and more observations from more and more people with better and better cameras, of these kind of UAPs that we'll get a better handle on it. And it would be the greatest day of my life, I think, if we discovered definitive evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence.
So you're not with Stephen Hawking, who was saying if they are out there, we should stay away from them.
I think it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a little too narrowly Darwinian for me, And it's also, I've tried to come up as a science fiction writer with, scenarios as to why they would want our planet.
Right.
We're probably pretty rare, we've got these beautiful oceans and breathable atmosphere, and blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, to go back to that, if they can travel across interstellar space at superluminal velocities,
That's right.
they can build artificial environments like Dyson spheres and Niven rings, or just hollow out an asteroid, and set it spinning, and create whatever the hell environment they want. They don't need our planet, and probably our planet is uniquely suited to our life. I would be surprised even if there are other, and there probably are other, what Star Trek would call M-class planets out there. I would be surprised if any of those, even if they had oxygen, nitrogen atmospheres and all the rest of it, I don't know that any of them will be suitable for human life, because it's about a lot more than air and water. It's also about, the microbiota and the radiation and other factors unique to those worlds. If they have an atmosphere like us, they probably have life, and it might be like us, or it might be very different, and it might be something that would be a very big problem for us to adapt to if we decided we wanted to try to colonize such a planet, assuming we could even get there, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't it they're looking at Io, the moon, right now? It looks kind of suitable for us, or is that still?
No, it's not so much suitable for us as below the icy crust there is a liquid water ocean, probably highly saline, which is why we can detect it, because of some magnetism that it would manifest.
It's one of Jupiter's moons, right?
One of Jupiter's moons. Titan, a moon of Saturn, has a thick atmosphere of, I think is it carbon dioxide or nitrogen? I think it's mostly, I should know this. I think it's mostly nitrogen. At the surface, it's about 1.5 times as dense as our atmosphere. So it's very cold there, but you wouldn't need a pressure suit. You would need thermal insulation, and you would need an oxygen mask and headgear to protect you from the extreme cold. Methane is liquid on the surface of Titan, and it has methane lakes and rivers. And water ice, is like solid rock, more dense than ice in your freezer, Really cool, interesting place. That might be a suitable place for humans to establish some kind of an outpost. It would be more manageable in a lot of ways than even the moon or Mars, But on the other hand, there's a lot we don't know about it, and living in that kind of an environment. But I think finding something where we could just, step out of the spaceship and take a deep breath and and feel like, wow, this is amazing that we can live here, even if we had warp drive. I think that those kinds of places are probably few and far between, but truth is we just don't know yet. We don't have the statistics, and eventually we will, and then we'll know.
Nice.
Do you have anything that you'd like to promote at all?
I wish. Well, I do. Yeah, I do. One thing, I do have a book about the Orville coming out.
Oh,
nice.
Awesome. Yeah,
sometime next year, not sure when. It is an in-universe book, meaning it treats the ship and its crew as if they're real.
Yeah.
And it's something that's going to be published next year by Dark Horse.
Oh.
Dark Horse did some Orville comics a couple of years ago, which are very cool, that David Goodman wrote with some other people. And so, they approached Seth and David about an idea for a book, and they asked me, and they liked my idea.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so I wrote that over the last couple of years, and got delayed because of COVID and other stuff. But that should hopefully come out next year sometime.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, well, we'll post it whenever it's out. Just let us know.
Absolutely.
We'll post it in our socials, and we'll let our followers know.
Oh, great.
Andre, thank you so much. We've already taken up 2 hours of your time.
We really did?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
It was
so
a pleasure.
sorry.
We could talk to you all night. I mean,
went
we
by
really
like
could,
that.
because we're such nerds, and we're just like absorbing everything you're throwing out.
This is great.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I've rarely, in recent years, told my origin story.
Yeah.
And I haven't thought about it in a long time. So I appreciate you guys
Of
having
course.
me dredge that up,
Oh,
as
thank
it were.
you. Yeah.
Because
thank you
it's
for
like,
sharing.
God, you know, it's such a wild, unlikely thing. It's the last thing I ever expected to do.
Yeah.
When I was a kid or growing up and going to college and in my 20s and into my early 30s, it's like never had any idea that I would end up doing what I'm doing now. So for those of you out there who are still in your late teens or early 20s or whatever, and you're still kind of casting about for what you want to do with your life, give yourself time, and find something you really get excited about, and do the work that it takes to get there and see what happens.
That's right. That's great advice.
Yeah.
I don't think you can say anything else to end the show any better.
Oh,
exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great
Andre,
to
for
see you
coming on.
guys, and thanks so
Yeah,
much.
absolutely.
I really enjoyed
You're
it.
welcome back whenever you want. Honestly, we could talk to you for hours. So.
Well, thanks. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
that.
All right. Take us out.
Yeah, just thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to rate and review. And we're on Instagram, Twitter, if you guys want to reach out and to the Nerdom. And
we'll be at Pasadena Comic Con.
We'll be at Pasadena Comic Con in January.
Yep. So come see us.
Yeah, so come check us out.
We'll be raffling some stuff off, and and you can see us. Say hi to us.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.